CD 7. In the Jerilderie letter, Ned demands that the authorities give those people who are suffering innocence, justice and liberty. The only way this makes any sense is that Joe Byrne misspelled innocence with a TS as innocence with a CE. In other words, it's the same demand as the one in the Euroa letter. Although the 23 sympathisers had been arrested by the time the Jerilderie letter was written, this is not a demand to release them, as some have implied. In fact, Ned never mentions them at all in any interviews or letters. Ian Jones was so keen to imply that the phrase, "give those people who are suffering innocence, justice and liberty," is a Republican demand, that in at least one publication, according to historian Stuart Dawson, Jones inserted the word "in" and claimed the text of the Jerilderie letter reads, "give those people who are suffering in innocence, justice and liberty." Jones, in Ned Kelly, A Short Life, claims the Jerilderie letter contains the only available fragments of a rebel manifesto that underlay the attempt to proclaim a republic in the northeast. John Maloney, in I Am Ned Kelly, 1980, declares that Ned's diatribe about his family and friends being mistreated is an indication that the gang's battle with the law represents evidence that a far wider circle of people in the northeast felt that in some way the struggle was the struggle of them all. It is drawing a very long bow to claim that in among the rants against the police interspersed with tangential, uninformed views of history, racist remarks and egotism, there is any evidence that Ned is calling for a republic in the Jerilderie letter. It's much easier to see the letter as an illogical tirade of self-justification by a man who has murdered 3 policemen. Time and again, the letter begins with some bizarre argument about imaginary situations, demonstrating a complete ignorance of any real grasp of history or general knowledge that quickly turns into "poor me, it's all about me," egomaniacal ravings. What would England do if America declared war and hoisted a green flag, as it is all Irishmen that has got command army forts of her batteries? Even her very lifeguards and beef tasters are Irish. Would they not slew around and fight her with their own arms for the sake of the colour they dare not wear for years, and to reinstate it and rise old Erin's Isle once more from the pressure of tyrannism of the English yoke, and which has kept in poverty and starvation and caused them to wear the enemy's coat? What else can England expect? Is there not big fat-necked unicorns enough paid to torment and drive me to do thing which I don't wish to do without the public assisting them? There's a lot about Ned's friends and family being innocent, revenge, self-justification and a personal vendetta, and there's a lot about old Erin and convicts, but nothing at all about the idea of an uprising to form a republic. As Stuart Dawson points out, genuine Republican and Irish uprisings in colonial history, like the Vinegar Hill Rebellion and the Eureka Stockade, don't seem to exist in Ned's fantasy world of anecdotal generalisations about the convict days and the troubles of old Erin. On the 2nd of January 1914, the Jerilderie Herald and Urana Advertiser ran an article about the letter and quoted the town's schoolteacher William Elliott, the man who read the letter and wired a précis to the Melbourne Argus. Elliott is quoted as saying that, in general, the letter was, in his opinion, little better than emanations of wild fancies from a disordered brain. Personally, I fail to see how anyone can disagree with Dawson's conclusion that there is no support for the Kelly Republic theory in the Jerilderie letter. The claim is built on the false hypothesis of it being a precursor document for a declaration of a republic that never existed. It is hard to calculate just how much support Ned did have before the myth grew larger than the man and Ned Kelly became a symbol of Australianness, gameness and republicanism. The sarcastic and derogatory editorial aside in the Ovens and Murray Advertiser on the 8th of April 1880 that 9 out of 10 bush hands and swagmen in the local area covertly took pleasure in the Kelly gang's exploits is nowhere near being accurate. In fact, the detailed demographic analysis undertaken by Doug Morrissey for his honours thesis in history at La Trobe University in 1977, Ned Kelly's Sympathisers, calculates that less than 2 men out of 10 in the parishes of Greta, Lurg and Glenrowan were Kelly sympathisers. Morrissey found that the support for Kelly has generally been exaggerated by his sympathetic biographers and by outraged newspaper editors at the time. Much of the support was also obviously based on fear and a desire to be left alone by the gang. Stuart Dawson summarises Morrissey's findings this way. The nucleus of this support was the Greta mob, the group of bush larrikins, hooligans, who accepted Ned Kelly as their leader. Numbering about 40. 83% of its members were the Australian-born sons of Irish-born parents, and 56% had been convicted for criminal offences, mostly horse stealing. If we take the wider group of 124 people identified by the police as active Kelly supporters, 78% were of Irish birth or parentage. About 100 people attended Dan's funeral after his death at Glenrowan, which seems to tally with Morrissey's assumptions about local support and the police calculations. There was no trouble at the funeral. Many local settlers were fed up with the government's poor efforts at policing and an inept, underfunded police force. To them, the Kellys were highlighting a problem. Some selectors, but certainly not a majority, had gripes about the system of land distribution, but this was not a case of poor against the ruling class or the persecuted Irish against authority, as Ned attempted to make out in the letters. Similarly, Kelly sympathisers point to the 34,434 signatures collected to have Ned's death sentence commuted. On the other hand, that campaign was mostly conducted by the Society for the Abolition of Capital Punishment. It was more about opposition to capital punishment than it was about Ned Kelly. Of course, the Conservative press claimed many in Kelly country were forced to sign it, and the Sydney Morning Herald pompously reported on the 9th of November 1880 that an examination of the petitions showed that they were signed principally in pencil and by illiterate people, while whole pages were evidently written by the one person. Some wag also apparently pointed out that at least 245,566 citizens out of Melbourne's 280,000 residents had chosen not to sign it. As far as being truly representative of the poor battlers and free selectors who supposedly saw Ned as a leader who was just like them and would trust him to create a new republic, the Kellys, especially after the death of father and husband John Red Kelly, were far from being typical battlers or free selectors. A year after Red's death, matriarch Ellen moved the family to a derelict hotel building in Greta in May 1867. They shared the dwelling with 2 of her sisters, who had married the 2 Lloyd brothers, and their children. The 2 husbands were imprisoned for horse theft. On the 27th of January 1868, Red's brother, James Jim Kelly, recently released from prison, set fire to the building after a drunken argument with Ellen. The 3 sisters and their families, 16 people in total, survived the fire. In April the following year, Jim Kelly was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to death, commuted to 15 years in prison. He spent most of the rest of his life in Ararat and Beechworth lunatic asylums. By the time Jim was sentenced, Ellen had moved the family onto an 88-acre, 36-hectare selection at the 11 Mile, 5 kilometres west of Greta and about 8 kilometres south of Glenrowan. Her brothers and sisters lived in this area, and her father, James Quinn, had taken a lease on the nearby Glenmore Run in the King Valley in 1864, after he sold a property in Wallen. The Glenmore Run was a perfect conduit for stolen horses and cattle between the colonies of Victoria and New South Wales. It was also a safe haven for the notorious escaped bushranger Harry Power, a family friend of the Quinns and Lloyds. Ellen and her sons never made any attempt to farm the selection. Ellen turned it into a sly grog shanty and primitive doss house. The floor of the rough slab hut was dirt. The walls were hessian. The Quinn clan arranged for Ned, from the age of 13, to help Harry Power in his highway robberies as a sort of apprentice. Ned's first arrest, however, was for assaulting a Chinese miner and peddler named, hilariously, Fook. The case was unproven. These are the police court records for Ellen and her 3 sons. Ellen Kelly, 1867, abusive and threatening language, fine £2. 1870, illegally selling alcohol, discharged. 1871, furious riding in a public place, discharged. 1872, stealing a saddle, discharged. 1878, aiding and abetting attempted murder, 3 years. Edward Ned Kelly, 1869, assault and robbery, discharged. 1870, robbery in company, robbery under arms, twice, discharged. 1870, violent assault, 3 months, sending an indecent letter, 3 months. This was the result of sending calves' testicles to the childless wife of a family enemy. 1871, horse stealing and receiving, 3 years. 1877, drunk and disorderly, 1 shilling. Assaulting police, £2 and 5 shillings. Resisting police, £2. 1880, horse theft, attempted murder and murder. Death. Dan Kelly, 1871, illegal use of a horse, discharged. 1876, stealing a saddle, discharged. 1877, violent assault, breaking in and stealing, willful damage, discharged. 1880, horse theft and murder, died at Glenrowan. Jim Kelly, 1871, illegal use of a horse, discharged. 1873, cattle stealing, 2 counts, 5 years. 1878, horse stealing, 3 years. When Ned was arrested at age 15 for robbery in company, he was held until he gave information that helped the police find and arrest Harry Power. Although it was Ned's uncle, John Lloyd, who led the police to the bushrangers' hideout, Power never forgave Ned and openly accused him of treachery for the rest of his life, both in and out of prison. Power outlived Ned by 11 years and was never backward in coming forward to blacken Ned's reputation with accusations that he was betrayed by Ned. Even some within the Quinn, Lloyd, Kelly mob, along with others in the district, were treating Ned as an outcast. At age 15, Ned wrote to the police asking for help. The note ended in a poorly punctuated plea. "Everyone looks on me like a black snake. Send me an answer as soon as possible." When the police arranged for Ned to go and work on a sheep station over the border, Ellen vetoed the idea. Between 1860 and 1879, 7 of Ellen's brothers, brothers-in-law and nephews were charged with a total of 42 crimes and convicted of 16, including assault, willful damage, indecent assault, bodily harm, murderous assault, horse and cattle theft, and maliciously killing horses. While running the sly grog shanty, Ellen became pregnant to a man named Frost and successfully took him to court for maintenance of the child. That court victory resulted in the drunken ride through town for which she was arrested but discharged. While Ned was in prison in 1872, she met a 23-year-old American named George King and had his child. They married in 1874, and she eventually bore him 3 children. Ned claimed that he went straight after his release, and for a brief time he worked cutting timber and in a sawmill, but then became a self-confessed systematic horse thief in collaboration with his stepfather, brother Dan, uncles and cousins. When the whole operation was beginning to be exposed in early 1878, warrants were issued for the Baumgarten brothers, who were receiving the stolen horses on the other side of the Murray River. Later, warrants were issued for the arrest of Dan and Ned for horse stealing, and this led to policeman Alexander Fitzpatrick's ill-advised attempt to arrest Dan, the event that triggered Ellen's arrest and the outlawing of the gang. One thing that is rarely explored in depth is the disappearance of Ellen's second husband, George King. This occurred around the time of the Baumgarten arrests. There is no evidence of an American aged around 30 anywhere in the colony after 1878. There are 2 theories. The first is that with the criminal operation exposed, King, who had married Ellen and fathered her last 3 children, deserted her, shot through, and changed his name. The second is that King was beating Ellen. There were rumours of repeated domestic violence, and he and Ned went for a ride to look at some horses, and only Ned returned. Whatever the truth is, the Kellys never mentioned him again. Ellen was always referred to as Mrs. Kelly, although she was actually Mrs. King. George King's children were raised as Kellys. Ned ended the Jerilderie letter with the famous line, "I am a widow's son, outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed." Although the letter is full of egotistical, self-justifying nonsense, I can't help wondering whether that statement was technically true. And Ned knew it. To claim the Kellys, Quinns and Lloyds were typical Aussie battlers is an insult to the real battlers who settled in the bush and built a decent life there. Under the revised Land Acts of the 1860s, almost 80% of selectors in the Greta district successfully gained freehold of their selections within the required 10 years. About half of them achieved this result purely by farming, and the other half by working at other jobs and farming. Only 10% of selectors regularly defaulted on their payments, and one of those was Ellen Kelly, who took 23 years to satisfy the requirements for the selection at the 11 Mile. The rest of the story has been written 1,000 times. It goes like this. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Ned and Dan for horse stealing. A policeman named Fitzpatrick foolishly attempted to arrest Dan at the 11 Mile hut. Dan and Ellen attacked them. Ned, who claimed he was not there, shot him in the wrist. Ned and Dan fled into hiding in the Wombat Ranges. Ellen was arrested and sentenced to 3 years. A party of 4 police was sent to track down gang members Ned, Dan, Steve Hart and Joe Byrne. The gang ambushed the police and killed 3 of them at Stringybark Creek. The 4 fugitives then held up and robbed the towns of Euroa in Victoria and Jerilderie in New South Wales and planned a showdown by murdering a former gang member, Aaron Sherritt. This, as expected, brought a trainload of police to Glenrowan. The gang forced Fettlers camped near Glenrowan Station to tear up the tracks and then held more than 30 locals prisoner in Ann Jones's hotel for 24 hours while they waited for the train. The plan was to kill all the police, either in the train wreck or by shooting the survivors. The siege occurred when the train arrived safely after Ned allowed a school teacher named Curnow to leave the pub to attend to his supposedly sick wife. Curnow stopped the train at 2:30 a.m. on the 27th of June 1879. The siege began at 3 a.m. The four outlaws donned their heavy armour and went onto the veranda and invited the police to shoot. A gun battle ensued, in which 2 hostages were killed by stray police bullets. Ned left the hotel wounded and, unable to mount his horse, lay in the bush until 7 a.m. He then attacked the police and was shot down and captured. Joe Byrne was shot through the groin under his armour and died. The last of the hostages were released at 10 a.m. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart refused to surrender. The police set fire to the hotel at 4 p.m. Dan and Steve possibly suicided or were burned to death in the fire. It has been proposed that members of the Greta mob were to be called by Ned to help hunt down any survivors of the train wreck, and the signal was the firing of 2 rockets. When the train wreck never happened, there were reports that 2 rockets were fired from the besieged pub, but the only ones to arrive were 2 of Ned's sisters and Greta mob member Isaiah Wilde Wright, who were on their way anyway and made no attempt to interfere with the police. The supposed rallying of an army of sympathisers, predicted in some accounts to occur at Glenrowan once the train was wrecked, never happened. Neither, of course, did the train wreck. The story that Ned left the hotel to ride off and turn back a large group of supporters is pure fantasy. The time frame from the veranda gun battle from 4:30 to 5 a.m. and Ned's surprise appearance out of the mist to attack the police at 7 a.m. doesn't fit. While awaiting execution, Ned told another prisoner that badly wounded and weighed down by 90 kilograms of metal, he couldn't even mount his horse after leaving the hotel. Ned was tried and hanged in Melbourne jail on the 11th of November 1880. The true story of John Red Kelly. The second furphy that props up the notion that the Kelly uprising was about republicanism, the rebel spirit, and a consequence of persecution of the Irish, derives from misinformation about Ned's father, John Red Kelly, and claims that he was an Irish rebel. He was, in fact, convicted of stealing pigs. In 1929, a book called The Complete Inner History of the Kelly Gang and Their Pursuers was published at Moe in Victoria by the Kelly Gang Publishing Company, Proprietary Limited. In effect, the Kelly Gang Publishing Company was also the author, Catholic schoolteacher, trade unionist and Labor Party stalwart J. Keneally. And the book was a defence of the Kellys against what Keneally believed to be the lies told by other historians. The book was also Keneally's reaction to the sectarian antagonism towards Catholics in Victoria, which was keenly felt in the 1870s debate over state aid to Catholic schools, Bishop Mannix's opposition to conscription in World War I, and the attempt by Catholics to take over the Labor Party. Bob Rees, in his article Ned Kelly's Father in Exiles from Erin, notes that Keneally's response to the claim that the Kellys were nothing more than poor, habitual and even hereditary criminals was not to investigate John Kelly's Irish background more closely, but to invest him instead with an Irish nationalist pedigree at the time when memories of Easter 1916 were still fresh and the Irish Free State was just 8 years old. Keneally certainly did that. Here is his description of Ned's father. John Red Kelly, the father of Ned and Dan, was born in County Tipperary, Ireland. He was a fearless young man of some education and outstanding ability. He was the type of young Irish patriot who was prepared to make even the supreme sacrifice for his country's freedom. He was a man whom the landlords and their henchmen regarded as a menace to the continuation of injustices so maliciously inflicted on the people of Ireland. Like other patriots, he was charged with an agrarian offence, but not assault or murder, as falsely stated by the Royal Commission after Ned Kelly's execution. With jury packing reduced to a fine art, the ruling class in Tipperary had no difficulty in securing his conviction and transportation to Van Diemen's Land. It is true that Ned's father was never charged with assault or murder, and it is true that the Royal Commission wrongly surmised that he was charged with those crimes when it was, in fact, another convict called John Kelly. The convict records clearly identify Red, by his description and Irish court records, as the pig-stealing John Kelly. The other man had black hair for a start. John Kelly was a very common name. It is false to claim that Red Kelly was charged with an agrarian crime. Agrarian crimes were rebellious protests involving murders, shootings, threats and destruction of property carried out from about 1790 to the 1880s against tenants deemed to have secured small holdings unfairly from Protestant landlords, and later against the landlords themselves. For the first few decades of the struggle, these crimes were carried out at night by local secret societies with names like Magpies, Rockites, White Boys and Jays. Red Kelly's crimes were, however, merely agricultural rather than agrarian. He stole, or attempted to steal, pigs and cattle. The son of Thomas Kelly and Mary Cody, who reared a family of 7 on less than half an acre of land at Clonbrogan near the village of Moyglass, which is 8 miles, 12 kilometres, from Cashel in County Tipperary, John Kelly was baptised on the 20th of February 1820 in Moyglass Church, in the parish of Killinall. Today there's nothing left of the Kelly home, clearly marked on maps in the 1840s near Slievenamen Mountain, but the records contained in Ireland, County of Tipperary, South Riding, Barony of Middlethird, Unions of Callan, Cashel, Tipperary and Clonmel Primary Valuation, published in Dublin by Her Majesty's printers in 1850, tell us it stood on 1 rood and 23 perches of land rented from Jeremiah Scully Esquire for 6 shillings per annum, and that the rent on their dwelling, a 1-room mud and thatch cabin, was valued at 7 shillings per annum. In 1841, Red was convicted of pig stealing. Irish police records show that on the 4th of December 1840, John Kelly stole 2 pigs, value about £6, from James Cooney, a labourer living at Ballyshean, near Cashel. The police report, written by Sub-Inspector Cox of New Park Police Barracks, the closest police station to Ballyshean, states, Cashel, 7th December, 40. Have to report that on the 4th inst, about 4 a.m, 2 pigs, valued about £6, the property of James Cooney, were stolen by one John Kelly, who drove them to Cahir Market, distance 14 miles, and there sold them to a person named Flood, who afterwards, on the same day, sold them to a pig buyer from Carrick on Suir. The police, hearing of the occurrence, were on the alert, and Constable Hallam, assisted by H. Johnson, succeeded on same night in arresting Kelly in a lodging house in this city and placing him in Bridewell. Hallam proceeded by order of Captain Haig on the morning of the 5th to Carrick, accompanied by Flood, and returned on the last night, having discovered and brought back the pigs. Informations were this day sworn against Kelly for the offence, and he stands committed for trial. This Kelly, who is a notorious character, is the person alluded in my report of the 19th ultimo as being an accomplice of Reagan's, who was wounded by Mabanham police. I have not visited Cooney's place, as I would gain no information by so doing. Joseph Cox, 1st Sub-Inspector. This crime was not an isolated incident. There is more to the story, and it's of particular interest in terms of the sort of role models Ned had from his father's side of the family, as well as his mother's side. The sub-inspectors claim that John Kelly was a notorious character at the age of 21 is an indication that he was at least suspected of a number of other crimes and misdemeanours. The incident of the 19th ultimo refers to the theft of 7 cows several weeks earlier, and John Kelly's involvement is of particular interest. The trials resulting from these 2 alleged crimes were held at the Cashel Quarter Sessions on the 6th and 7th of January 1841. The first trial on the 6th of January concerned the theft of the cows. The British Archive trial record states, Pat Reagan, a notorious character, was put to the bar, charged with stealing 7 fat cows off the lands of Moyglass, the property of James Ryle Esquire. Constable Perry swore that in consequence of this information he received that an attempt would be made on the night of the 17th November to steal Mr. Ryle's cows, proceeded with 2 other policemen to the crossroads close to Moyglass, where he found the prisoner at the head of or before the cows, which were being driven by another man whom he saw. To prevent them from turning to another road, seizing the prisoner, who placed a pistol on his breast and snapped it at him. The prisoner then got from him among the cows, when the witness and his comrade fired at and wounded him. The prisoner effected his escape, but was next morning arrested in the house of a person named Marr, which was in the immediate neighbourhood. This witness knew the other man who was driving the cows. Constable Murphy proved that there was a third man concerned in driving the cows, and added that the prisoner could not be secured without firing at him. On 9th of January 1841, the Clonmel Herald reported on the second trial, which occurred on the 7th of January 1841, the day after Reagan's trial. John Kelly, indicted for stealing pigs, the property of James Cooney, was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years' transportation. This culprit was an accomplice with Patrick Reagan, found guilty yesterday of stealing Mr. Ryle's cows. It was he that gave information respecting Reagan. So, Constable Perry recognised a second man involved in the theft of the cows, and Constable Murphy stated that there was a third man. One of those was obviously Red Kelly, who had, when arrested, informed on Reagan. Kelly was found guilty only of the theft of the pigs and sentenced to 7 years' transportation to Van Diemen's Land. He was not tried for the theft of the cows, most likely because he had informed against Reagan. Reagan was sentenced to 10 years' transportation, but died in prison 6 weeks later from the wounds received on the night of the 17th of November 1840. As we have already discovered, the report of the Royal Commission into the circumstances of the Kelly outbreak of 1881 made an error when it noted, John Kelly, who was the father of the outlaws, was a convict, having been transported from Tipperary Island to Tasmania in 1841 for an agrarian outrage, said to have been shooting at a landlord with intent to murder. The report is completely wrong with the said to have been information. The convict records, as previously stated, identify the John Kelly charged with what was generally termed an agrarian outrage as a different person. There have been many attempts by authors to paint John Red Kelly as an Irish rebel in order to give credence to the freedom fighter myth that surrounds the Kelly gang. The truth is that he was known to local police by age 21 as a notorious character who was, in the space of 3 weeks, involved in stealing 2 pigs and, in company with 2 others, attempting to steal 7 cows. He then gave information to the police that led to the arrest and conviction of Pat Reagan. Red Kelly was merely a poor thief who stole from his neighbours. The author Frank Clune, in his book The Kelly Hunters, implied that Red Kelly was unfairly victimised and treated as a rebel for an insignificant crime, when he was merely a poverty-stricken victim of circumstance. Pig stealing, especially from a prosperous Irish farmer, was not a remarkable offence. It had no political implications. It is true that the crime was not political, but Clune tries to make a case that the police treated Red Kelly as if he was a rebel. The problem with this assumption is the implication that James Cooney was a prosperous Irish farmer, when, in fact, he was nothing of the kind. Bob Rees, in Chapter 10 of his collection of essays, Exiles from Erin, points out that Cooney, far from being the prosperous farmer portrayed by Clune, was a landless labourer like Kelly's father. Rees refers to a report to the Commissioners of the Poor Inquiry, Ireland, of 1836, that contains a witness statement that in the barony of Middlethird, a man holding from 5 to 10 acres, 2 to 4 hectares, is called a cottier. He is distinguished from a labourer who holds less or no land. In that same year, 1836, British Liberal statesman Sir George Cornwall Lewis, best known for his efforts to keep Britain neutral during the American Civil War, remarked in a reply to the report of the Select Committee Investigations into Poverty and Outrages in Ireland that, in a large part of Ireland there is less security of person and property than in any other part of Europe, except perhaps the wildest districts of Calabria or Greece. The one-room, mud and thatch cabin that John Kelly's parents and family inhabited was valued for rental at 7 shillings a year. To say that stealing pigs valued at £6 from a neighbour, whose circumstances were similar to your own, was not a remarkable offence, is true only in respect of the fact that Ireland at the time had the worst crime rate in Western Europe, a situation that was exacerbated by the almost unimaginable state of poverty in which the bulk of the population lived. To infer that stealing anything worth the price of 15 years' rent was not a serious crime is ridiculous. There is a photograph taken in 1988 of Cooney's dwelling that shows it to be a small, one-room stone cottage. Ned's father was no Irish rebel. He never liked to talk about his past, and although he made some attempts to improve himself and build a decent life for his family, basically he was a semi-literate thief whose life was sadly blighted in his earlier years by poverty and criminal tendencies, and in later life by alcoholism. Red Kelly served 2 years in a convict work gang south of Hobart, and was only in trouble once for absence and misconduct, which got him 2 months' hard labour in chains. He was never flogged and behaved reasonably well. He was then assigned as a servant to a family near Launceston and obtained his ticket of leave in 1845. But could not depart the colony of Van Diemen's Land until his sentence expired in 1848. He obtained work from a farming family and, in spite of being reported by them and fined 5 shillings for being drunk and disorderly in 1847, he was given good reports as being quiet and orderly. He was apparently working as a handyman and acquired some rudimentary building skills in this time. In 1848, like many other ex-convict Vandemonians as they were known, he made his way to the mainland colony of New South Wales in what was known as the Port Phillip district of that colony, which 2 years later would become the separate colony of Victoria. There is no evidence that Red Kelly was harassed by police at any time after leaving Ireland, as Keneally claimed. In fact, He personally had no problems with the law for 18 years between 1847 and 1865. His contact with the police in Ireland was, it appears, due to his criminal tendencies, and ended with him dobbing on his partner in crime, Pat Reagan. There is no evidence of rebel activities. The Vandemonian Trail was a well-worn migration path that led from Hobart via Port Albert to Gippsland and on to the Victorian High Country, or via Beechworth and Mansfield to the developing grazing districts of the Riverina, or to the fertile areas being developed as cattle-raising districts in Gippsland or north of Melbourne to the west. Many ex-convicts, sons of convicts, ex-bushrangers, gold seekers and other Vandemonians made their way along this trail to the cattle-grazing country and later to the various goldfields of Victoria during the boom years of the 1850s. By 1850, Red was working just north of Melbourne at Beveridge as a timber getter, wood splitter, fencer and bush carpenter. There were many Irish Catholic families in the area, and many of them were families of ex-convicts from Van Diemen's Land who had followed the Vandemonian Trail and settled in the district. Many other poor Irish migrants arrived as free settlers during the Great Potato Famine. Kilmore is the oldest inland town in Victoria, and the area just to the north of Melbourne from Donnybrook to Beveridge and Wallen and north to Kilmore was very much an Irish Catholic community. Even today, in these secular, irreligious times, the latest census figures show Kilmore's population to be more than 1/3 practising Catholic, over 50% more than the Australian average, and well ahead of the Anglicans at 13%, and even ahead of no religion at 30%. Apparently, Red met his future wife's father, James Quinn, in a pub in Donnybrook, and sometime later, looking for a secluded place to set up a still and start an illegal whisky-making operation, he visited the Quinn family's farm at Wallen to discuss the scheme. The Quinns had emigrated as assisted free settlers from County Antrim in Ireland and settled in the Port Phillip district of the colony of New South Wales in July 1841. They arrived with 10 children and another was added to the family after their arrival. They farmed firstly at Brunswick and then moved north to Wallen. It appears that James Quinn, whose extended family were certainly not averse to illegal activities themselves, was suspicious of his fellow countryman, an ex-convict with alcoholic tendencies, and rejected the plan to join him in the scheme. It was on that visit, however, that 30-year-old Red Kelly made the acquaintance of Quinn's 17-year-old daughter, Ellen, and, much to her father's chagrin, Ellen became pregnant to Red in May 1850. Evidently this caused major rows and upheavals between father and daughter until finally James Quinn gave up the battle to keep his daughter from marrying the ex-convict and agreed to let Kelly build a hut for himself and his bride on the Quinn property after they were married in Melbourne in November 1850. Red worked for Ellen's father, and the child, Mary Jane, was born in February 1851 but died in infancy before the end of the year. In June and July 1851, gold was discovered in the newly created colony of Victoria near Clunes and Castlemaine and later Ballarat. Red spent most of 1853 at the goldfields and managed to find enough gold to buy a 40-acre farm at Beveridge, a little closer to Melbourne. He moved Ellen and their second-born, a daughter named Anne, to their new home, and Ned was born there in 1854. The Kelly family fortunes ebbed and flowed for 10 years at Beveridge. Red purchased a half-acre block in town, built a house on it, and even became a landlord for a time. Later, he mortgaged the farm for £200, then sold it at a loss, along with half of his town block. He built a shack on the other half of the block and the family lived there until Red purchased a smaller farm and another town block. Finally, in 1864, he sold up all his property at Beveridge for £80 and moved the family 75 kilometres north to Avenel in the Strathbogie Ranges, where he rented a farm for £14 a year. There were now 6 children, and a 7th was born after Red moved the family to Avenel in 1865. Red and Ellen were semi-literate, being able to read but not write. During their time at Beveridge, the 3 oldest children attended the local school at a cost of 4p each per week. This meant that Anne, Ned and Margaret, unlike their parents, were able to both read and write. Ned excelled at sport and was apparently an athletic boy and an average student. Ned attended school until he was at least 11. At 16, he was literate enough to write a badly spelled letter to the police asking for help. Later in life, however, he dictated letters for Joe Byrne to write, and a note attached to a letter from Police Superintendent Edmund Fosbury to the New South Wales Premier Henry Parkes as part of their discussions about the Kelly Gang reward states, "My dear Sir Henry, neither Ned nor Dan Kelly can write. That is, that they can scarcely write their names. The Victorian Constable states that they get sympathisers to write letters for them." This is obviously a misunderstanding, based on Joe being the gang's scribe, or simply a lie told by the police. Ellen's sister Margaret and her husband Patrick also lived in Beveridge with a large family and appear to have been well-respected, law-abiding people. Margaret's husband came from Galway during the gold rushes, and although he and Margaret shared the same surname, he was no relation to her family. The fact that Margaret was a Quinn by birth and a Quinn by marriage was pure coincidence. Ellen and Margaret also had an older brother named Patrick Quinn. It has been conjectured that Red moved Ellen and their children to Beveridge away from the criminal influence of the family at Wallen, or that Ellen wished to be near her sister at Beveridge, or that the move was a compromise. But such assumptions are nothing more than guesswork. Also during the Beveridge years, 1856 to be exact, 5 of Red's siblings, James, Jim, Edward, Daniel, Anne and Mary, having survived the Great Potato Famine that devastated Ireland between 1845 and 1852, emigrated to Victoria on the Malden, arriving in Melbourne in July 1856. Red's brother James, known mostly as Jim, who was 15 years younger than Red, came to live with Red's family at Beveridge. In April 1863, at the age of 8, Ned Kelly had his first experience of the criminal justice system and his first experience of lying in a courtroom, when he gave evidence at the Kilmore General Sessions trial of his uncle Jim Kelly, who was charged with cattle theft. Ned's evidence that he had been at home with his uncle when the cattle were stolen did not convince the police magistrate, who subsequently convicted Uncle Jim and sentenced him to 3 years hard labour. Jim Kelly had been arrested 3 times for cattle theft before being convicted. All his life, Ned Kelly would be surrounded by members of his mother's extended family and their friends and in-laws who were habitual criminals. From the age of 6, he was also under the permanent bad influence of 2 male role models, his paternal Uncle Jim and his alcoholic father Red. The family move to Avenel in 1864 may have been due to the failing financial situation, or Red's alcoholism, or a desire to get away from a growing reputation in the district for criminal activities after the arrival of Red's younger brother. There is certainly no evidence of police harassment, as has been suggested by Keneally. It was at Avenel in 1866 that 11-year-old Ned saved the life of 7-year-old Richard Shelton. Richard, who could not swim, was on his way to school when his hat blew into the creek, and in trying to retrieve it, he fell in. Ned jumped in and saved his life. Richard's father, a local publican, presented Ned with a green sash at a school ceremony as a reward for his brave act. Ned cherished the sash, possibly as a reminder of his humanity as a youngster, as well as his bravery and athleticism. He wore it under his armour at Glenrowan, and stained with Ned's blood, it is on display in the Benalla Museum. At Avenel, Red Kelly, after 18 years, was finally again in trouble with the police in May 1865. Accused of stealing a calf from a neighbour, he was found guilty only of being in possession of the hide of a stolen beast. It is plausible to assume that the Kellys, or someone they knew, had eaten the rest of the evidence. Red did not appear in court to answer the charge. The fine was £25. It is perhaps evidence of the family's descent into poverty at this time that Red could not pay the fine and served about 4 of the 6 months' hard labour sentence in Pentridge in lieu of payment. He was certainly free by the 3rd of October 1865 when he registered the birth of his last child, Grace, at Campion's store in Avenel, listing his birthplace as Clonbrogan, Moyglass, County Tipperary, Ireland, and his age as 45. Red died just over a year later, on the 27th of December 1866, of what was then called dropsy, possibly edema of the kidneys or liver, one of the complications of sustained alcohol abuse. His death was reported by his son Edward, Ned Kelly, who was 11 years of age. John Red Kelly was buried in an unmarked grave in Avenel Cemetery, Victoria, on the 29th of December 1866. With his father dead and his uncle in prison, Ned was now the oldest male in the household, but it was his mother, the matriarch Ellen, who was the unchallenged head of the Kelly family. Red Kelly was, according to J.J. Keneally, a victim of the campaign of anti-Irish hatred so well organised in the colonies, where Irish patriotism was such an unforgivable crime in the eyes of the British government officials in the colony of Victoria that even the serving of a savage sentence would not wipe it out. This statement needs serious analysis. It's nonsense. Firstly, it was written by an Irish Catholic schoolteacher and political activist almost 50 years after Ned was hanged. Keneally had lived and taught in Catholic schools throughout the decades of heated debate that followed the withdrawal of colonial government aid to Catholic schools in 1873, and had no doubt been subjected to the vitriol and sectarian hatred that was part of the conscription debate in World War I. The campaign of anti-Irish hatred that Keneally claims the colonial government aimed at Red Kelly is a retrospective invention that reflects Keneally's struggle against the anti-Catholic sentiments that were part of his own lifetime, not Red Kelly's. Secondly, it is really distorting the truth to call Red's convict experiences the serving of a savage sentence. The convict system was harsh, it is true, but of the 162,000 convicts transported to the Australian colonies, Red appears to have been one of the luckier ones. He arrived in Hobart in January 1842, not on a brutal convict ship, but with a small group of 11 convicts on the merchant ship Prince Regent. He was never flogged. He was reasonably well behaved, apart from one misdemeanour, and he was described as quiet and orderly. He served almost exactly 2.5 years of his 7-year sentence before being released on a ticket of leave to live freely and seek work within the colony of Van Diemen's Land. Thirdly, the suggestion that Irish patriotism was an unforgivable crime in the eyes of British government officials in the colony of Victoria really needs some scrutiny. It's rubbish. John O'Shannessy, the undisputed leader of the Irish Catholics in Victoria, was Premier of that colony 3 times between 1857 and 1863. He was a proud Irishman born in Tipperary 2 years before Red Kelly. O'Shannessy migrated to Melbourne with his new wife in 1839, again about 2 years before Red Kelly arrived in Hobart. All men in the colony of Victoria, including Irishmen, were granted the right to vote in 1857, regardless of land possession or wealth. The Minister for Lands in the colony of Victoria, twice during the last decade of Red's life, was Charles Gavin Duffy, an Irish Catholic who revised and improved the Selection Acts and brought into law the Act that made it easier for landless Victorians to gain land and thus a degree of independence. The Act bears his name, the Duffy Land Act of 1862. In 1871 and 1872, when Ned was in prison for horse stealing, Duffy was the Premier of Victoria. During the 3 years 1877 to 1880, when Ned was outlawed, Duffy was the Speaker of the House in Victoria's colonial government. The problem with Keneally's assertion that Irish patriotism was an unforgivable crime in Victoria is that Duffy was something that Red Kelly never was and never had been, an Irish rebel. Charles Gavin Duffy was born in Monaghan in 1816. As leader of the Young Ireland movement, he was active in the rebel movement with Daniel O'Connell and set up the weekly Nation newspaper to promote Irish culture and emancipation and defend Catholicism. Duffy was imprisoned and tried 5 times under the 1848 Treason and Felony Act. After his release, Duffy represented New Ross in the British House of Commons from 1852 to 1855. Disillusioned after failing to achieve land reforms in Ireland, he migrated to Victoria, set up as a barrister, and was elected into the first Victorian Colonial Legislative Assembly. He was the only member of the Assembly to have served in the British Parliament and was therefore a great asset to the government and a much respected figure. It seems to me that Keneally's view of Victoria's history is a little distorted by the political struggles in which he was involved in his own lifetime, and his assumptions lack any historic perspective or balanced view of the past. In his tirade about the colonial government in the Jerilderie letter, just after a reference to the tyrannism of the English yoke, Ned raged about politicians as big fat-necked unicorns paid enough to torment and drive me to do thing which I don't wish to do. Ned was possibly ignorant of the fact that at least one of those, the Speaker of the House, was a genuine Irish rebel. If he'd known, he wouldn't have cared. It wouldn't have fitted into his fantasy world. Ned's letters, those dictated at Jerilderie and Euroa and those sent to Victorian Premier Graham Berry and his New South Wales counterpart Henry Parkes, reveal no real understanding of colonial politics or history. They are all about Ned himself and how specific acts by authorities had impinged on his activities. Constable Bracken, one of the hostages at the siege of Glenrowan, reported, "When we were held prisoners in the hotel, Ned Kelly began talking about politics. When Bracken asked Ned's opinion of the Premier, the constable reported that Ned replied, 'I have written to Berry, and he would not publish my letter, and he gave too much money to the police for my capture.' There's no big picture or informed opinion, just a subjective, rather simple-minded reaction to 2 specific items relating to Ned." Bracken claims that Ned then declared that the Berry government were all damned fools to bother their heads about Parliament at all, for this is our country. Even this, the childish dismissal of the need for any government at all, coming from a stressed and desperate man who'd not slept for days and had no real understanding of how the government worked or what it could and couldn't do, has been seen as a call for a republic. If Ned's throwaway comment meant anything at all, it obviously was intended to mean something like, "Who needs Parliament anyway?" It cannot by any stretch of the imagination be interpreted to mean, "I am, however, going to bother my head about creating a republican government in this part of the colony." Perhaps the last word should be from the final interview with Ned's mother Ellen, conducted by Bartlett Adamson and published in Smith's Weekly on the 7th of April 1923, a week after Ellen died aged 91. Describing the room in which the interview took place, Adamson noted, "The kitchen was decorated with various photographs. One was of the late historic Kate, who became Mrs. Foster, while another was that of her son Fred, who was killed in the Great War. There was also the large photo of Ned Kelly, black hair and luxuriant black beard, taken the day before his execution. Opposite to this, whether in symbolic defiance or as a sign of amity it is difficult to say, was a picture of King Edward, now sometime deceased." Part 7. Iconic Folklore Furphies. "As to poetry, you know," said Humpty Dumpty, "I can repeat poetry as well as other folk if it comes to that." "Oh, it needn't come to that," Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. Through the Looking-Glass, Lewis Carroll, 1871. Facts evolve into folklore. I must say, when it comes to folklore, folk songs and bush verse, I can understand Alice's apprehension only too well. In my time, I have sat through quite a few overlong and badly recited versions of The Man from Snowy River at bush verse competitions and events, and as a member of the long-gone Aussie folk band Bandy Bill & Co. for more than 10 years, there are a few songs about sheep and cattle that I don't miss having to sing or listen to. It's in the nature of folklore and folk songs to evolve and proliferate into various versions with different verses, tunes, and claims of origin. When we are too lazy to find out the truth, we say what we'd like to be true, and call it folklore. I remember only too well that when I was compiling and editing the Australasian Post's magazine's bush verse page 20 years ago, and compiling anthologies of bush verse for publication, I would come across verse labelled anonymous that I knew was written by popular verse writers like Bruce Simpson, Cole Wilson, Wilbur Howcroft, Graham Watt and others. Even worse, authorship was often wrongly claimed, knowingly or inadvertently by others. It was not uncommon for family members to find a book of handwritten verse after Grandad passed away and assume he wrote the verse, when it was in fact a collection of verse written by others that he had written out by hand and often recited. Dad and Dave. Where a story or folk tale begins its life and where it ends up are often a long way apart. A good case in point is the saga of Dad and Dave. The characters were created by Arthur Huey Davis, the 8th of 13 children of a Welsh blacksmith, an ex-convict father, and an Irish mother who fled the Great Potato Famine. The family grew up on a selection at Emu Creek on the Darling Downs near Toowoomba. Arthur left school at age 12 and worked as a stock rider before joining the public service in Brisbane at 15 and making a career in the sheriff's office. He sent his first story to the Bulletin in 1895. His first collection of 26 stories, On Our Selection, in 1899, and Our New Selection followed in 1903. The stories were whimsically humorous accounts of the hard life of a family on a bush selection, and the characters of Dad, Dave, Mum, Mabel, and the rest of the family became incredibly popular. So much so that Davis, who wrote under the pen name of Steele Rudd, retired at the age of 35 and lived from his writing income for the rest of his life. He produced volumes of stories and even had his own magazine, Rudd's Magazine, which ran successfully for 4 years at 6pence a copy. Dad and Dave, Mum and Mabel became iconic Aussie characters. They were used as the protagonists for every yokel joke and smutty joke told in every Australian playground and pub. The original stories were, however, anecdotal accounts of bush life. If you ask any older Aussie where Dad and Dave live, however, they will not say on the Darling Downs. They will say Snake Gully, and some may even know it's near Gundagai. This is because, through a hugely popular radio serial version of the stories, the family became associated with the mythical town of Snake Gully, set near the New South Wales town of Gundagai. You'll even find statues of the family in the park at Gundagai. Naturally, the style of the stories was altered somewhat by the radio scriptwriters. The musical theme of the radio series was the well-known popular tune Along the Road to Gundagai, written by prolific songwriter Melbourne's Jack O'Hagan. This, naturally, cemented the idea in Australian minds that the family lived near Gundagai and their selection was down there at Snake Gully. What makes the whole business even more fascinating and amusing is that Jack O'Hagan's famous song, written in 1922, was only about Gundagai because the Murrumbidgee River, which flows through the town, has 4 syllables. O'Hagan began writing a song called Along the Road to Bundaberg, but the river at Bundaberg, the Burnett, has only 2 syllables, and Jack wanted 4 syllables without using the word river to make one line scan and sing nicely. So he looked for a town with the same number of syllables, 3, situated on a river with 4 syllables, Murrumbidgee, and found Gundagai. O'Hagan also wrote the popular song Where the Dog Sits on the Tucker Box, often known as 5 Miles from Gundagai, which places one of the characters from the stories, Mabel, in the same location. When he was invited to be the special guest at Gundagai's centenary celebrations in 1951, Jack revealed the truth about his famous song and admitted that he'd never been to Gundagai in his life until that day. So, although the incredibly popular Dad and Dave stories were set in Queensland and the author's personal experiences and reminiscences were all of the Darling Downs district and trips to Brisbane, the radio serial, statues and songs have put Dad, Dave, Mum and Mabel well and truly in Snake Gully, near the southern New South Wales town of Gundagai. Who wrote our unofficial anthem? In his 20s, Andrew Barton Patterson, aspiring writer, was partner in a law firm with John Street, who had a cousin named Sarah Riley. Patterson was not known as Banjo in those days. His friends and family called him Barty, from his middle name Barton. He and Sarah became engaged in 1887 and remained so for 8 years. A few months after the shearers' strikes and unrest in Queensland in 1894, Sarah and Barty visited her brother's property, Vindex, near Winton, in Queensland. Sarah had been educated at Oberwell Ladies' College in Melbourne, and her best friend at school was Christina McPherson, one of the 11 children of Ewan McPherson, who owned Pichelba, a 150,000-acre, 60,700 hectare property near Wangaratta. He also owned Dagworth, which adjoined Vindex near Winton. When Ewan took his unmarried daughters Christina and Jane to visit Dagworth in early 1895, the two old school friends were delighted to be staying so close, and many house parties were arranged. At one of these parties, Christina played a tune on an auto harp. It was one that she had heard played by a band at a race meeting in May the previous year, when visiting her married sister at Warrnambool. The tune was from a Scottish song, Ye Bonny Woods o' Craigie Lee, which Christina learned by ear. Her version of it became the original tune to some words written by Patterson about the shearers' struggle with landowners. In September 1894, a group of striking shearers had burned the Dagworth shearing shed which contained 150 lambs. This act caused police to be sent to the area, and they hunted for the culprit with the station manager, Ewan Macpherson's son, Robert. The man accused of lighting the fire, Samuel Hoffmeister, was found dead in a dry billabong. The inquest said suicide, but many thought otherwise. As Patterson was often a guest in the house of the man who may well have been an accessory to the murder, he had to be circumspect, and the lyrics he wrote were more allegorical than factual. The collaboration between Christina and Patterson evidently developed into far more than a songwriting exercise. It seems there was a strong romantic bond, flirtation, and possibly more between the two, which led to the breaking of Patterson's engagement to Sarah Riley and eventually led to the end of the law firm partnership as well. Neither Sarah Riley nor Christina Macpherson ever married. The song? Oh yes, it was Waltzing Matilda. Patterson wrote 4 simple verses. In the first, the swagman is camped in a dry section of the billabong boiling his billy for tea. In the second verse, a sheep comes to drink and the swagman grabs it and turns it into tucker, i.e. slaughters it for food. Then, in verse 3, the squatter arrives with the police and accuses the swagman of stealing the sheep. Finally, the swagman suicides by drowning in the deeper part of the billabong, which is then haunted by his ghost. Into this simple story of an iconic Aussie figure killing a sheep and being harassed into suicide by a landowner and the police, Patterson wove echoes of the shearers' strike and struggles against authority. He also suggested that the repercussions would haunt us for some time to come. This ends CD 7. CD 8. The chorus of the song was totally unrelated to the storyline. It implied that there were many stories to be heard in the bush, and wandering the outback like a swaggy with someone you loved was a thing to be desired and enjoyed. It seemed to put the verses into the realm of folklore, and the original idea for a title was Carrying a Swag, which was used as a subtitle to the lyric when it was written as verse. Certain historians have argued that the verses contain a relatively harmless allegorical version of the struggles of the shearers' strikes, while the chorus suggests a flirtation between the lyricist and the composer. Here is the original lyric, as written by Banjo Patterson. Oh, there once was a swagman camped in the billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he looked at his old billy boiling, Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? In the original manuscript, Patterson wrote, Who'll come a roving Australia with me? He then crossed out roving Australia and substituted waltzing Matilda, and used it for the rest of the lyric. The words then continue. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading a water bag. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Down came a jumbuck to drink at the water hole. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him in glee, and he sang as he put him away in his tucker bag, You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? waltzing Matilda and leading a water bag, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Down came the squatter, a-riding his thoroughbred. Down came policemen, 1, 2 and 3. Whose is the jumbuck you've got in the tucker bag? You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading a water bag. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? But the swagman he up and he jumped in the water-hole, drowning himself by the coolabah tree, and his ghost may be heard as it sings in the billabong, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Who'll come a waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading a water bag, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? The chorus refers to dancing. Matilda was a term for a swag, a blanket rolled and containing a swagman's belongings, that he carried slung over his shoulder, either across his chest or on his back. The term waltzing Matild was originally German and referred to soldiers carrying their belongings while on campaigns. On long treks between battles, the army would be followed by large numbers of camp followers in wagons. These various entrepreneurs provided services such as food and supplies that were not part of standard army provisions. One of the services offered was, of course, sex for profit, and the women who provided such things were universally referred to as Matild. Thus, waltzing Matild was German army slang for being on the march and having no female companion to dance with or sleep with, just your blanket roll to keep you company on the road and in camp at night. The blanket roll became your Matild, a substitute for what you could not access or afford. The term was brought to Australia by German migrants during the gold rushes. Leading a water bag is also a dancing reference. The billy and water bag usually hung from the swag at the back. Thus, a swaggy led the dance, and the water bag followed. Banjo was always rather publicly dismissive of the song, which no doubt was a source of sadness and embarrassing memories for him. The evidence inclines me to think he wanted to forget the whole thing. In his 1944 publication, The Story of Waltzing Matilda, Sidney May referred to Patterson having sad memories of his stay in Winton. Clement Semler, in The Banjo of the Bush, states, Patterson had a greater affection for this ballad than most of his others. Others have mentioned that Winton and Dagworth had sad memories for Patterson. The reason then is purely simple. He did not marry Sarah Riley. 8 years later, in April 1903, Patterson married Alice Walker of Tenterfield Station, near the town of the same name in northern New South Wales. The couple had met the previous year when he visited the property. Towards the end of 1902, possibly needing cash for the impending wedding, Patterson arranged to sell the copyright of his latest book of collected verse, Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses, to his publisher, Angus and Robertson. At the same time, he also sold the copyright of some unwanted verses and unpublished verse and sketches to Angus and Robertson. And among the discarded writing was Waltzing Matilda. The amount received for these bits and pieces is usually reported to be £5 or £10. Angus and Robertson now owned the lyric, and they then leased the musical rights to James Inglis and Company, who owned the Billy T Company. James Inglis and Co. had the rights to set the words to music and publish the work as a song. Their intention was to do that and use the song as an advertising tool for their tea. Several tunes were tried, and finally the wife of the managing director of James Inglis & Co., Marie Cowan, composed the jaunty march tune that we all know today. There is some suggestion that Patterson sent her a copy of the tune that Christina McPherson had played. In a letter written in 1931, Christina explained that Patterson wrote to her several years after they had created the song together, asking her for a copy of the tune, and he then passed it on to a musical friend. Others think the musical friend was Harry Nathan, whose version of the song, published by Palings, appeared very late in 1902. There are no known copies of the sheet music of Nathan's version in existence, so we cannot compare his version of the tune or the words until a copy is found under the lid of some old piano stool. Banjo certainly was sent as a courtesy the final version of the Marie Cowan song. He is reported to have said in a telephone conversation that she had done a good job and wished the company good luck with the project. However, Marie Cowan, or somebody else, also changed the words quite significantly. In one of his radio talks in 1936, Banjo said, "Miss Macpherson used to play a little Scottish tune on a zither, and I put words to it and called it Waltzing Matilda." Banjo said he liked the whimsicality and dreaminess of the tune and thought it would be nice to set some words to it. There is very little dreaminess in Marie Cowan's tune, and Patterson's whimsicality in the chorus is completely lost, with 3 of the 4 choruses reinforcing the idea of the billy and the tea. Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Down came a jumbuck to drink at that billabong, up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. And he sang as he shoved that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Up rode a squatter, mounted on his thoroughbred. Down came troopers, 1, 2, 3. "Whose is that jumbuck you've got in the tucker bag? You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Up jumped the swagman and sprang into the billabong. "You'll never catch me alive," said he, "and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." The swagman has become jolly, not Patterson's idea at all. The swagman is camped by the billabong rather than in it. A billabong is formed when a river that meanders over flat terrain forms a new channel in a flood and cuts off one of its own bends, which then becomes a small lake of still water. In the billabong is a more genuine bush saying than by a billabong. Other changes to the actual verses include the policemen becoming troopers, which gives the song a much older context than 1894, and dilutes the connection to the shearers' strikes. Patterson's swagman looked at his old billy boiling, while Marie Cowan's character watched and waited for his billy, with a capital B for the company name, to boil. Patterson's swagman put him, the jumbuck, away in his tucker bag, after the butchering had been done, obviously. In Marie Cowan's version he shoves him, sometimes stows him in the tucker bag, after grabbing him. Her version implies that a live sheep is being shoved into a tucker bag before it has been turned into tucker, which makes no sense in real bush terms. Finally, Patterson's swaggy is drowning himself in the waterhole. This is seen by some researchers as a reference to the often queried verdict of suicide in the Hofmeister case. Marie Cowan's swaggy jumps up and springs into the billabong, yelling, "You'll never catch me alive." These changes are all in the verses, but the most important changes occur in the chorus. The dancing imagery and suggestion is almost gone, and only Waltzing Matilda remains, leading a water bag is lost, and so is my darling, and the words Waltzing Matilda are repeated and placed in a strong march tempo rather than the more graceful and gentle original tune, which suggests romantic dancing. Marie Cowan's version also introduces the repetition of "and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled" in the chorus and first two verses. In general, her version has less feel of the bush and the time of the events, while Patterson's original has a more genuine bush feel and uses bush terminology. Marie Cowan's words are what you might expect from someone in the city writing about the bush from lack of first-hand experience, someone not properly understanding the original sense of the story, someone who thinks being a swaggy is jolly. There is also a suggestion that Marie Cowan's version was actually influenced by another version of Patterson's original set to music. It appears that she was not the first one to attempt the exercise. Harry Nathan was a Sydney singer and musician and grandson of the flamboyant English composer Isaac Nathan, who had taught singing to the royal children and collaborated musically with Lord Byron before emigrating to Sydney and composing Australia's first opera, Don John of Austria, in 1847. Writing in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 14th of August 2015, when the fuss erupted about the copyright ownership of the song, Greg Pemberton correctly stated that as there was no Commonwealth copyright law until 1905, state laws still applied in 1903, and Nathan's version, published by Palings in December 1902 and crediting banjo with the lyrics, was copyrighted in Queensland in March 1903. Pemberton mistakenly assumes that Nathan found the poem in Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses, the copyright of which Patterson sold to Angus and Robertson in January 1903. Pemberton is correct when he says that the copyright transfer was registered in New South Wales on January 12, 1903 as number 03/1725. Patterson sold the copyright for a lump sum outright and thus gave up his ownership of the lyric. Unfortunately, Pemberton wrongly assumes that Waltzing Matilda was published in Rio Grande's Last Stand and Other Verses. It was not. The first publication of Waltzing Matilda as a poem did not occur until 1917 in Saltbush Bill, J.P. and Other Verses. There is no version of Waltzing Matilda in Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses. However, it was part of the bits and pieces also sold to Angus and Robertson at the same time as that collection of verse. So, while Pemberton makes a simple error in claiming that anyone could have seen the lyrics in Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses, it is true that Angus and Robertson now had the right to sell or lease the musical rights to use the words as song lyrics. It appears that they sold the musical rights to Palings, as well as James Inglis & Co. Pemberton is quite right to say that other versions of the song had been around before 1903, reportedly in the Boer War, possibly sung to a well-known folk tune called the Bold Fusilier. It is not true, however, that others could not have known Christina Macpherson's unpublished tune from Dagworth. The song was very popular around the Winton and Longreach districts, and there are reports that the whole district was singing it in the late 1890s. Not long after the song was written, Patterson and Christina sang it using a piano in the parlour of the North Gregory Hotel in Winton. They also visited nearby Oondaroo Station, where the song was sung by a gifted and trained baritone, Herbert Ramsay, later Sir Herbert Ramsay, who was a cousin of the owners. Apparently, he also sang it at the Post Office Hotel in Winton. The song spread by word of mouth throughout the district, and on the 25th of September 1900, when the Governor of Queensland, Lord Charles Lamington, visited Winton, Herbert Ramsay sang the song again at a banquet held in the Governor's honour at the North Gregory Hotel. In his book, Waltzing Matilda, The Secret History of Australia's Favourite Song, folklorist and relentless Patterson researcher Dennis O'Keefe wrote, "The original song was also sung by soldiers at the Boer War. From there, Waltzing Matilda found its way back to Sydney, either via soldiers who lived in Sydney or via returned men travelling through Sydney on their way back to Western Queensland. Perhaps Marie Cowan had heard the song then." In his attempt to make sense of the tangled history of the song's copyright in the Sydney Morning Herald article, Greg Pemberton explained some of the difficulties. Melbourne music publishers, Messrs. Allen & Co., said they bought the word's copyright from Angus and Robertson in 1923 and paid royalties to Cowan for the music, a claim they maintained when Banjo's daughter sought ownership. Yet there is no record of this transaction, although registration was not mandatory. Allen & Co. claimed the exchange of copyright took place and they paid Marie Cowan's estate royalties on the strength of her son's word that the tune we know today was hers. Later versions of the song lyrics altered the choruses so that each chorus repeated the third line of the previous verse. Patterson sold the words for a few quid and seemed glad to forget it. When it refused to go away, he gave it a few passing nostalgic thoughts. His family was always reluctant to deal with the song and its origins in biographies after his death, especially after their attempts to claim some royalties failed. So, did Banjo write Waltzing Matilda as we know it? I would say he certainly did not write the version we sing with great gusto today, and the tune to which he set his version is nothing like the tune we know today. The words are based on some he wrote, but the Marie Cowan words, which tell the story as a sort of folk tale for kids, are far closer to the way we understand the jolly song we sing. As to where the Marie Cowan words and later versions of them came from, who knows? Marie herself certainly wrote some of them, and perhaps soldiers in the Boer War or Harry Nathan's version provided others. It's way too late to revert to the original, which is a shame. To me, it has the loveliest, whimsical and dreamlike melody, with the best chorus of the lot. Footnote. Oddly enough, Christina McPherson has a different claim to fame in Aussie history, one that predates all this. On the 8th of April 1865, the psychotic bushranger, arsonist and murderer Daniel Mad Dan Morgan arrived at the McPherson homestead, Peachelba, near Wangaratta, and held the family and their employees hostage at gunpoint in the dining room. Morgan was the most wanted man in the colonies at the time, known for his erratic behaviour and sadistic tendencies. He once held up a station and wounded a man, then apologised and allowed another to ride for the doctor, then changed his mind again and rode after the man and killed him. On this occasion, having rounded up all the adults on the property as prisoners in the dining room, he allowed Alice Keenan, a nursemaid, to go to attend a crying infant in another room. The brave girl climbed through a window and ran to the next homestead, home of the McPhersons' relatives, the Rutherfords. They notified the local police and a trap was set. Next morning, as Morgan was leaving the homestead, a station hand named John Quinlan, the best shot in the district, shot him in the back. Morgan died of his wounds, and the event was celebrated in the press with gruesome photographs of his body mutilated by souvenir collectors propped against the stable. The infant whose crying caused Mad Dan Morgan to allow Alice Keenan to leave the room and consequently bring his life to a bloody and gruesome end was 15-month-old Christina Rutherford McPherson. Christina lived quietly as a spinster in Melbourne until she died aged 72 in 1936. Her relatives said Patterson's behaviour had scandalised the families involved. The myth of the dog on the tucker box. The evolution of verse songs and bush folklore stories into more acceptable versions of the originals that make more sense in a modern context or in a more contemporary vernacular is probably not of any great importance in the big scheme of things. When the whole point of the story is lost, however, or the moral is reversed, we obviously lose the true sense of what the story was trying to tell us about the attitudes, humour, and social beliefs of the time. Once again, the tendency is to rewrite history to suit our contemporary attitudes and beliefs. One of the most amusing Aussie examples of such a reversal in the real intent behind a story is the myth of the iconic dog on the tucker box statue, just outside the town of Gundagai. My mother often told me that the statue and the poem were a tribute to both the hard-working bullockys and their brave and loyal dogs who guarded their belongings as their owners slept beneath the wagon. The verse by Jack Moses, which led to the song by Jack O'Hagan and the famous statue, was about the trials and tribulations suffered by the bullocky and his faithful dog. I been jilted, jarred and crossed in love, and sandbagged in the dark, till if a mountain fell on me I'd treat it as a lark. It's when you've got your bullocks bogged, that's the time you flog and cry, and the dog sits on the tucker box, 9 miles from Gundagai. This was based on an earlier poem by an anonymous poet calling himself Bo Yang York. Jack Moses' poem echoed the sentiments of the earlier poem, which was about the hard life shared by the bullocky and his canine companion which guarded the precious tucker box. Jack Moses' version of the verse ends with the song being reverentially buried in the tucker box. Well, the truth of the matter is that an even earlier original poem, on which Bo Yang York's verse is based, had a slightly different theme. While it was about the hard life of a bullocky, the dog, in the original version, was part of the problem, rather than a loyal companion that alleviated some of the bullocky's hardships. I'm used to punching bullock teams across the hills and plains. I've teamed out back for 40 years in blazing droughts and rains. I've lived a heap of troubles down without a bloomin' lie. But I can't forget what happened to me 9 miles from Gundagai. 'Twas getting dark. The team got bogged. The axle snapped in two. I lost me matches and me pipe. God, what was I to do? The rain came on, 'twas bitter cold, and hungry too was I. And the dog, he shat in me tucker box, 9 miles from Gundagai. Some blokes I know has lots of luck, no matter how they fall. But there was I, Lord love a duck, no bloody luck at all. I couldn't make a pot of tea or get me trousers dry. And the dog shat in me tucker box, 9 miles from Gundagai. I can forgive the blinkin' team. I can forgive the rain. I can forgive the cold and dark and go through it all again. I can forgive me rotten luck, but hang me till I die, I can't forgive that bloody dog 9 miles from Gundagai. Another version differs slightly. Good morning, mate, you are too late, the shearing is all over. Tie up your dog behind a log and come and have some Dover. For Nobby Jack has broke the yoke, poked out the leader's eye, and the dog shat in the tucker box 5 miles from Gundagai. NB, author's italics, Dover was a brand name for a bushman's clasp knife and thus became a slang term for any food, meat or damper cut and eaten with such a knife. Various crude versions of this rhyme were popular among bullockies but could not be printed at that time. Some versions avoided the scatological reference by saying the dog sat in the tucker box, which would still have spoiled the food to an extent. But Bo Yang York's cleaned-up version, called Bill the Bullocky, reads, As I was comin' down Conroy's Gap, I heard a maiden cry, "There goes Bill the Bullocky, he's bound for Gundagai. A better poor old beggar never cracked an honest crust. A tougher poor old beggar never drug a whip through dust. His team got bogged at 5 Mile Creek. Bill lashed and swore and cried, 'If Nobby don't get me out of this, I'll tattoo his bloody hide.' But Nobby strained and broke his yoke and poked out the leader's eye. And the dog sat on the tucker box 5 miles from Gundagai." In changing one letter from shat to sat, obviously in an attempt to make the verse more marketable and acceptable in mixed company, Boyang York managed to change the entire meaning of the story and make the disgusting canine villain into a hero. It is also interesting to note that the various versions cannot even agree on the distance from Gundagai. Is it 5 or 9 miles? There is a lesson there in just how quickly any facts become clouded in uncertainty. Part 8. The Legend of Breaker Morant. Who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, 1865. The Mysterious Mr. Morant. The execution of Lieutenants Harry Morant and Peter Handcock, and the circumstances surrounding the episode and the events that led to it, provide yet another example of myth-building to the point where certain basic facts are completely overlooked. The plethora of books, articles, documentaries, mock retrials, debates, and the movie have, in a similar fashion to the Ned Kelly case, made the truth virtually irrelevant. The mythology is so powerful, and the mysteries surrounding insignificant aspects of the lives of the men involved are so argued over that facts that would be otherwise glaringly obvious seem to be ignored or discounted as mere background details. I am of the opinion that if you step away from Breaker Morant as the central figure and look at the bigger picture, certain facts become clear and the legend unravels. Firstly, Morant was not even Australian. The British military did not recognise him as an Australian, nor did he think of himself as Australian. He actually claimed to be the son of a British admiral and maintained this claim until his death, apparently requesting in his last wishes that his belongings be sent to the admiral's family. Morant was a mystery man of uncertain background. We do know that he was born in Somerset, England, though there are questions about who his father was, quite probably not the admiral he claimed. And he was sent to Australia at the age of 19, possibly due to his misbehaviour surrounding unpaid gambling debts and a scandal involving a young woman. He spent 15 years in the colony, trying his hand at a range of occupations involving horses, developing a reputation for his reckless daring and horsemanship, and becoming a well-known writer of verse for the Bulletin magazine. He also became well-known for not paying his debts. How he came to take part in the Second South African War is also unclear. Some historians say that Morant saw the war originally as his ticket home to England, where he could redeem himself for his earlier disgrace that had him exiled to Australia. Whatever his reasons for joining the colonial regiment in Renmark, South Australia, at the outbreak of the war, it probably wasn't to fight for the Empire. Others believe that he only returned to the war and enlisted in the Bushveld Carbineers on the 1st of April 1901 because of his friend Captain Percy Hunt. The infamous Bushveld Carbineers regiment with which Morant served weren't all Australian. They were a British irregular regiment and a mix of Australians, English, South Africans, Americans, New Zealanders, Canadians and even a German.
However, the Boer War was the first war in which Australians fought together as a nation, and Australian soldiers did make a stand during the war at the Battle of Eland's River that established their reputation for bravery, skill and irreverence, which has been their trademark ever since. It is highly likely that Morant and Hancock were not the main targets of the investigation and court-martial. British Army intelligence probably constructed their case with an eye to removing one man, the disreputable Captain Arthur Taylor, from the army, and possibly bringing the Boers to the negotiating table. Taylor was not even a member of the Bushveld Carbineers, and there's evidence to show that he was protected by the military hierarchy to cover up their own disgraces. In fact, Morant and Hancock should have been pardoned as a military matter of course, regardless of whether they were guilty of criminal acts and murders, whether these were committed of their own volition for personal gain or under orders given from their superiors. Morant's and Hancock's heroism in the defence of the Pietersburg garrison during the raid by a Boer force saved the day, and it happened during the trial, while they were prisoners. Their lawyer filed for clemency, but it was denied. While Morant has been mythified in folklore as the Aussie underdog and scapegoat, it can be argued that it is Lieutenant Peter Hancock who was the real Aussie victim of this saga. Hancock has been vilified by some as a disgraced war criminal who committed atrocities and does not deserve a place in any honour roll of those who served. There have been recent calls to have his name removed from the monument at Bathurst that lists those who served in the war. Hancock was a self-confessed killer, but he was provably, patently and obviously following a direct order given by an immediate superior officer in every case. He was executed for obeying orders, rather than refusing to carry out a direct order. An honour roll records the men and women who enlisted and served without comment. It is not a record of an award. If you are going to remove the names of anyone accused of acting wrongly or possibly committing what we call war crimes, as Hancock was, then there are going to be a lot of investigations and removals of names to be undertaken. If you enlisted and served, your name should be there. In order to show how these things played out, we need to take a look at the background to the war, Australia's involvement, and the strange way the war progressed. It began as the last conflict fought in a traditional manner by British troops, but transformed into the first all-out guerrilla war, where the British employed such tactics as scorched earth policy, concentration camps for civilians, deportation of prisoners of war, and the execution of suspected enemies. There's a lot more to the story than the mystery of Mr. Morant. Background to the war. The first European settlement on the southern tip of Africa was set up by the Dutch East India Company in 1652 in order to serve as a staging post in the spice trade between Europe and the Dutch East Indies, where the Dutch had established control by defeating the Portuguese in a series of wars in the 17th century. The population of the Cape Colony 250 years after its beginning consisted of a mixture of the descendants of Dutch settlers, along with some Protestant Germans and French Huguenots and many people of mixed race, descendants of the European settlers, Malay and Central African slaves imported into the colony over several centuries, and the many indentured servants from the local Khoi and San people. These people were often referred to as Cape Coloureds, although many of the rural-dwelling farmers of the colony, known as Boers, were also of mixed-race ancestry. During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, factions developed in the colony supporting either side, and this led the British to intervene and seize the colony in 1803, give it back in 1805, and finally take control in 1806. In 1815, the Dutch accepted a payment of £6 million for the colony, and it became an undisputed British possession. The British administration immediately banned the Dutch language and established British customs, and this in turn led to many of the Boer colonists trekking away to the northeast to be out of reach of the British administration. This movement increased after 5,000 middle-class Britons migrated in the 1820s to help establish the colony as a British trading centre, and the trek became a flood after Emancipation Day in 1838, when the British declared all slaves to be free. Boer farmers relied on slaves, and many had purchased slaves on credit or used them as security for loans. The treks resulted in the displacement of some African tribes from their homelands and led to the establishment of independent Afrikaner colonies, which became the Boer republics. The British recognised the Republic of South Africa, Transvaal, in 1852 and granted sovereignty of part of the expanded Cape Colony to the Boers to become part of the Orange Free State after a savage war with the Basotho people in 1854. By the late 19th century, South Africa was made up of 4 major territories. The British Cape Colony extended along the western, southern and eastern coasts and up to the north, while the smaller British colony of Natal lay on the east coast. In between these British colonies were the landlocked Boer republics of the Orange Free State and, further north, the Transvaal, South African Republic. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in the north in 1869 led to a dispute over the sovereignty of the area, which was settled in favour of the Griqua mixed-race colonists who had settled there in the late 1820s. Fearing the Boers just across the border in the Orange Free State, the Griqua accepted British protection, and the protectorate was then made part of the Cape Colony in 1871. A British attempt to unite the colonies led to the annexation of the Transvaal in 1877, and a rebellion against British control 3 years later then led to the First South African War in 1880, which resulted in a British defeat and the Republic regaining its independence in 1881. The discovery of gold near Johannesburg in 1886 resulted in large numbers of British and other migrants heading north into the Transvaal, and was an excuse for the British to interfere in the affairs of the Republic on the pretext that migrants were being denied civil rights. In 1895, an incident known as the Jameson Raid occurred. It was an abortive attempt by 600 mercenaries employed by Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, part owner of the Kimberley mine and creator of the British colony of Rhodesia, to start an uprising on the goldfields in the Transvaal. It caused international outrage and led the Transvaal government, led by Paul Kruger, to form an alliance with the Orange Free State and seek help from Germany to arm the Republic and prepare for war. A telegram of congratulations to Kruger from the Kaiser after the Jameson Raid had deeply offended the British, and later in the war, a German volunteer unit fought for the Boers, as did several units from the Netherlands. In 1899, when Britain demanded that Kruger give the 60,000 foreign whites in the Witwatersrand goldfields voting rights, he refused and demanded the withdrawal of British troops from the borders of the South African Republic. When the British ignored the demand, Kruger declared war on the 11th of October 1899. The Boer troops were members of civilian militias, organised into military units called commandos. They elected their officers and a leader, titled Veldkornet, who called the men to arms when required. In the early phases of the war, the artillery and state-of-the-art weaponry was provided by the governments of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and mostly supplied by the German companies Mauser and Krupp. At first, the Boer army
which was made up of 25,000 Transvaal commandos, 15,000 Orange Free State commandos and 5,000 Cape Colony Boers, later supplemented by 5,000 European mercenaries, outnumbered the British troops. But enlistment in Britain was rapid, and this soon changed. Eventually, some 340,000 British and British Empire troops were involved in the conflict, including the first soldiers to fight as Australians. The Second South African Boer War. First phase, October 1899 to January 1900, 3 months. The Boer Commando Forces of the Transvaal, comprising 25,000 trained men equipped with 55,000 Mauser rifles, 50 million rounds of ammunition and the latest heavy artillery and Maxim guns, invaded the British colony of Natal to the east of the Orange Free State and laid siege to the town of Ladysmith. To the west, Boer commandos from the Transvaal and the Orange Free State invaded Cape Colony and cut off the British garrisons at Kimberley and Mafeking. The British under Commander-in-Chief Sir Redvers Buller, and fighting mainly as infantry, won battles at Talana and Elandslaagte in Natal, but suffered a series of defeats at Stormberg and Magersfontein in Cape Colony, and Colenso in Natal during the second week of December 1899. At Speenkop in the British Natal colony, 8,000 Boer commandos defeated 20,000 British infantry attempting to lift the siege at Ladysmith in January 1900. Second phase, February 1900 to September 1900, 8 months. Lord Roberts, with Lord Kitchener as his Chief of Staff, replaced British General Sir Redvers Buller, and under his command British troops turned the tide of the war. The 3 major sieges were lifted: Ladysmith in Natal on the 28th of February 1900, Cape Colony at Kimberley the 15th of February 1900, and Mafeking the 18th of May 1900. The retreating Boer armies were pursued, and in March 1900 the British took Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State. In May, the Orange Free State was annexed as the British Orange River Colony, and British troops entered Johannesburg in the Transvaal. Pretoria fell in June, and the Transvaal was annexed on the 1st of September 1900. Officially, as far as Britain was concerned, the war was won. Third phase, September 1900 to May 1902, 21 months. Due to the continued guerrilla activities against British troops in the Transvaal, Lord Roberts instituted a policy of burning farms and set up concentration camps as a form of control of the families whose farms were destroyed. Roberts then handed command to Lord Kitchener on the 23rd of December 1900 and returned home. Some of the Boers accepted British rule and became known as hands-uppers. When the war was rekindled, some of these men switched sides, fought with the British, and were known as joiners. Others again took up arms against the British and joined those who had refused to surrender and were known as bitter enders. Boer leaders Christian de Wet in the Orange Free State and Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, Koos de la Rey and Christian Frederick Beyers in the Transvaal set up small and mobile commando units to attack supply depots, disrupt communications, and make raids on outposts of the British Army of Occupation. Tactics were for the men to gather, make a raid, and then disappear back into the farming communities. Units of the 250,000-strong British Army would respond in force, but as soon as the troops left the area, the British again lost control of the district. This was especially the case in the frontier areas of the Transvaal. Each commando unit was made up of men from the district who had local support and knew the area.
The British response was to form irregular mobile regiments and establish outposts in forts and blockhouses protected by barbed wire. The British then embarked on a scorched earth campaign to deny support to the local commandos. 30,000 farms were burnt. 8,000 blockhouses were built and occupied by 50,000 troops, and 25,000 captured Boers were sent overseas to prisoner of war camps in Bermuda, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, India, and St Helena to prevent them escaping and rejoining the war. Then 200,000 displaced members of the Boer and African families were moved forcibly into more than 60 concentration camps, where a quarter of them died. These harsh tactics finally prevailed, and the last of the Boers surrendered in May 1902. The peace terms offered by the British were surprisingly generous. £3 million was given for the reconstruction, and the Boer republics were promised and granted limited self-government within the British Empire in 1906 and 1907. Finally, all the colonies and republics combined to become the Union of South Africa and remained part of the British Empire and, later, the British Commonwealth of Nations until voting to withdraw in 1960. It was during the Second South African War that Australia became a nation on the 1st of January 1901. Australians at the Boer War, a nation born in wartime. Unlike many other nations, ours was not born out of conflict or disagreement with the motherland. Quite the opposite is true. In fact, our nation formed at a time when support for Britain among Australians was at its absolute peak, and men were clamouring to fight for the old country, certainly not against it. In retrospect, it may seem odd to some that while the British colonies in Australia were in the process of becoming a nation and thus asserting some level of independence, the motherland had never been more popular, and Australians have arguably never been prouder of being British than they were in 1901. It is true to say that Australians then were in general more British than the British, and believed that the distant motherland could do no wrong in world affairs. The opposition to the war, much debated in British Parliament and newspapers in Britain in the later stages, was far more muted in Australia, although any hint of discrimination against our troops by British officers was much debated in the Australian press. The Second South African Boer War was the first time we fought as Australians, as our nation federated and was born during the course of the conflict. The first contingents sent to fight in South Africa were raised by the Australian colonies in response to the outbreak of war in 1899. Mostly these contingents were men in the militia of the various colonial forces. The next lot to go were what were called the Bushman contingents, recruited from more diverse sources and paid for by public subscription or by gifts from wealthy individuals. The next groups to be recruited were the Imperial Bushman contingents, which were raised in a similar way but paid for by the British government in London. Then there were draft contingents, which were raised by the state governments after Federation on behalf of the new Commonwealth government, which as yet didn't have the infrastructure to do so. These were technically the first Australian military units to fight for their country, or, more accurately, fight on behalf of their country for the British Empire. As far as the population of the Australian continent was concerned, there was no real distinction between being an Australian and being British. Australia may have been a nation in 1901, but her people were all subjects of the Queen. For 22 days at least until Victoria died and we became subjects of the King. The Australian Constitution does not mention the word citizen, referring only to the Australian people as subjects of the monarch. Australian travellers all held British passports until the first Australian passports were issued in 1949, and it became possible to be an Australian when overseas. About 16,000 Australians fought in what was almost always called the Boer War by Australians. They were under British command, and contingents were often broken up and attached to British forces. Towards the end of the war, Australian Commonwealth mounted contingents fought through the guerrilla phases of the war, which lasted until 1902. Few Australians, even today, have any idea how patently shameful and mercenary Britain's motives were in going to war in South Africa, or how brutal and inhumane were the tactics the British used to defeat the Boers. During the war, a total of 282 Australian troops died in action or from wounds sustained in battle, while 286 died from disease and another 38 in accidents or of unknown causes. 6 Australians received Victoria Crosses during the fighting in South Africa. In many ways, Australia's participation in the Second South African War serves as a reminder of just how British Australians were at the time we became a nation. It is interesting to consider just how much influence this had in shaping Australian attitudes to being an independent, indivisible nation. On the other hand, the way the Australians fought in South Africa was an indication of just how different those men were from their British counterparts. One obvious reason for this difference is the fact that the British troops were all regular army, while the Australians were all volunteers, and a large majority of them were bushmen. Our military history as a nation began in the Boer War. During an engagement in the Orange Free State at Stinkhoutboom Farm on the 24th of July 1900, New South Wales Army Medical Corps Captain Neville House rescued a young bugler who lay wounded and without shelter in the field of fire, and was awarded Australia's first Victoria Cross. Neville House was elected to federal parliament in 1922, was knighted twice, and became the Australian Minister for Defence in the Scullin government. He died of cancer in 1930, aged 67. Although his act of bravery occurred before Federation, his Victoria Cross is regarded as Australia's first, as it was officially gazetted on the 4th of June 1901, 6 months after we became a nation. The stereotype of the Australian soldier as a fearless, laconic, reckless and extremely efficient fighting man with a wry sense of black humour, which would become a source of great pride to Australians in both world wars, had its foundations in the Second South African War. There is no better example of this than the now long-forgotten Battle of Eland's River. During August 1900, a Boer commando force of around 3,000 men surrounded and laid siege to a storage post, which was defended by 299 Australian militia fighting as the Australian Imperial Bushmen. They were all citizen militiamen, made up of 141 Queenslanders, 105 men from New South Wales, 42 Victorians, 9 Western Australians and 2 Tasmanians, none of whom had ever been shot at before. They were joined by 200 Rhodesian volunteer militia. The Boers had 12 modern artillery pieces which pounded the post in its exposed position. They also had snipers positioned on 3 sides of the camp. The defenders had 1 Maxim gun and 1 old 7-pound muzzle-loader. Unfortunately, the supplies at Eland's River Post did not include ammunition. A British force led by Major General Sir Frederick Carrington attempted to reach the isolated outpost and save the day, but was repulsed and retreated. General Robert Baden-Powell assumed that the post had been taken by the Boers. On the 8th of August, Boer commander Koos de la Rey sent a messenger under a flag of truce
and offered to escort the force to the nearest British post, provided that none of the supplies within the camp were destroyed. In recognition of your courage and defence of your camp, he even offered to let the officers retain their weapons. Australian officers sent a written reply, which read, "If De la Rey wants our camp, why does he not come and take it? We will be pleased to meet him and his men and promise them a great reception at the end of a toasting fork. Australia will never surrender. Australia forever." The birth of our nation was still 4 months away, but our fighting spirit was already characteristic. It was especially poignant as the Australians fighting at Eland's River were actually part-time militiamen from different colonies who had volunteered to go to the war. When De la Rey sent a second offer of honourable surrender and safe passage, the British officer in command, Colonel Charles Hoare, replied, "Even if I wish to surrender to you, and I don't, I am commanding Australians, who would cut my throat if I accepted your terms." Meanwhile, a Boer messenger carrying a dispatch was captured, and it became known that the storage post at Eland's River had not yet surrendered. Lord Kitchener's army was on the march in a column that was 16 kilometres long, and detoured to Eland's River. The siege was lifted early on the 16th of August 1900. General Jan Smuts, who would later serve 2 terms as Prime Minister of South Africa, made the following comments about the defence of the Eland's River post. "There can only be one opinion about the fine determination and pluck of these stalwart colonials. To many, this terrific bombardment must have been their first experience of serious warfare. Deserted by their friends, and then, owing to unreasonable obstinacy, abandoned by their disappointed enemies, they simply sat tight until Kitchener's column finally disinterred them from the carcass-covered kopje." Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote in praise of the Australians, "They were sworn to die before the white flag would wave above them. And so fortune yielded as fortune will when brave men set their teeth. When the ballad makers of Australia seek for a subject, let them turn to Eland's River, for there was no finer fighting in the war." 15 years later, the Anzacs landed at Gallipoli, and the story of the colonial Australian troops at Eland's River faded from the nation's memory. But it was where the reputation of the Aussie digger as a laconic and fearless soldier was born. A popular patriotic poem written about the siege by George Essex Evans concludes, "And we laughed because we knew, in spite of hellfire and delay, on Australia's page forever, we had written Eland's River, we had written it forever and a day." So while Britain was the homeland or the old country, and could do no wrong as far as most Australians were concerned, the Second South African War was also the birthplace of the legendary reputation of the Aussie soldier. Part of this reputation was based on the differences in attitudes towards discipline and fair play between Australian soldiers and their British counterparts. Another difference that became apparent was the Australian soldier's ability to think for himself and act as the situation required, rather than follow traditional military protocols. One Boer commando in the force attacking the garrison at Eland's River later wrote, "For the first time in the war we were fighting men who used their own tactics against us. They were Australian volunteers, and although small in number, we could not take their position. They were the only troops who could scout into our lines at night and kill our sentries. Our men admitted that the Australians were more formidable and far more dangerous than any British troops." The Boer War was the first major war in which British officers, most of them from India, were put in charge of colonial volunteers. The officers were used to commanding career soldiers in a professional army under strict barrack-room rules and discipline. The colonial volunteers, who were actually better fighters than the British troops under the conditions of the war being fought, were disinclined to salute or obey officers they didn't respect, or to follow rules that seemed pointless. The laconic bravery of the Australian volunteer soldiers, as well as their disregard for British military protocols, would become legendary at Gallipoli, where one British officer described the Australian fighting man as the bravest thing God ever made. These characteristics were, however, already apparent in the Boer War. There is anecdotal evidence of many incidents in which Australian colonial troops showed a disregard for British military practices. When a trooper of the 2nd New South Wales Mounted Rifles was convicted of stealing a case of officers' whisky, on the rather flimsy evidence that it was too dark to see him but his voice was recognised, he was sentenced to a term of field imprisonment, which involved being crucified, tied, arms outstretched, to the wheel of a wagon all day. His mates, who felt the punishment did not fit the alleged crime, simply cut him free on the first 2 days and informed the British officer in charge, Major Charles Lydiard, who had hinted that they could be shot for their actions, that they would certainly continue to do so if that form of punishment was persevered with. There are also stories of colonial troops refusing to burn farms. On one such occasion, this led to British rifles being aimed at Australian troops. Evidently, however, a compromise was reached, and the Australians took up defensive positions, while the British troops performed the burning. Banjo Patterson, as a war correspondent in South Africa, came to realise that the differences between the British and Australian way of soldiering were incompatible. Australian soldiers, he believed, needed to be led by Australian officers and fight, albeit for Britain, under their own flag, not Britain's flag. Our own flag. They mustered us up with a royal din in wearisome weeks of drought, ere ever half of the crops were in or half of the sheds cut out. 'Twas down with a saddle and spurs and whip, the swagman dropped his swag, and we hurried us off to the outbound ship, to fight for the English flag. The English flag! It is ours, in sooth. We stand by it, wrong or right. But deep in our hearts is the honest truth. We fought for the sake of a fight. And the English flag may flutter and wave where the world-wide oceans toss, but the flag the Australian dies to save is the flag of the Southern Cross. If ever they want us to stand the brunt of a hard-fought, grim campaign, we will carry our own flag up to the front when we go to the wars again. The first time these differences in attitude towards soldiering led to Australians being court-martialled and sentenced to death was not the Bushveld Carbineers court-martial. It was the infamous incident that became known as the Wilmenrust ambush. On the 12th of June 1901, 270 men of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Victorian Mounted Rifles were detached from a column commanded by Major General Stuart Beatson, an ex-Indian Army officer known for his dislike of volunteer troops. They were sent with 2 Vickers Maxim pom-pom artillery pieces to look for a small Boer commando force believed to be some 40 kilometres to the east. Major McKnight, a Victorian, was the senior officer, but the force was under the command of another British ex-Indian Army officer, Major Morris. While encamped at Wilmenrust Farm, the force was ambushed in a surprise attack by Boer commandos, and the guns and 100 horses were stolen. 14 Victorians were killed and 42 wounded. Morris, who was an artillery officer in command of mounted riflemen, had set the sentry posts and pickets wide apart, cavalry fashion. The main outpost to watch for Boers was 1.5 kilometres from the camp. He had posted the picket stations in broad daylight, with the enemy in hiding, watching his every move. The Boers, guided by the farmer, easily sneaked between the sentries under cover of darkness, and the ambush was a total success. The Victorians, taken prisoner, were simply marched several kilometres out onto the veldt and released. Military historian Chris Coulthard-Clarke's assessment of the event is: the action at Wilmenrust was the most serious reverse to befall any overseas colonial force sent to the conflict in South Africa, and unfortunately was taken as an indictment of the courage and soldierly qualities of Australian contingents generally. There is no denying that a deplorable lack of vigilance and attention to security had been displayed, although the responsibility for this rested squarely on an imperial and not an Australian officer. The Encyclopedia of Australian Battles, Wilmensrust. Several days after the ambush, Major General Beatson rode over to a group of Victorian troopers and reputedly told them that they were a fat-arsed, pot-bellied, round-shouldered lot of wasters, and added, "All Australians are the same." The Victorian officer present, Major Harris, apparently replied that he was sorry to hear that, and pulled out a notebook and said that he would take the words down. Beatson apparently then said, "Do by all means, and you can add if you like that in my opinion they're a lot of white-livered curs. You can add dogs too." Harris reported to McKnight, who sent a report of the incident to the Victorian government and then asked permission from his superiors to go to Pretoria and ask for a full inquiry into the ambush. This was denied, but the men were paraded, and a memo from the man commanding the 5th Victorians, Major Umfleby, was read to them. It contained an apology from Beatson, who had pressured Umfleby into getting McKnight to back down. The Victorians were, however, sick of the treatment they received from British officers and wanted a direct apology. In his report to the man commanding Victoria's military, Major General Downes, McKnight said that the Victorians did their work loyally and well, and stated, "I knew it was the intention of the men to lay down their arms unless they could get another command. They said they could not serve with confidence under the present general. The men felt that there was no regard shown for their lives, and in some cases the punishments awarded were of a most humiliating character. When it became a question as to the reputation of the Victorians and consequently of the state that sent me out to Africa, I was compelled to protest strongly. I could see that the treatment of the officers and men from Victoria by the Chief of Staff, Major Waterfield, and afterward by General Beatson, must eventually cause trouble. Had the regiment been handled with even an ordinary amount of tact, no trouble would have arisen afterward between the men and their commander. Indeed, it did cause trouble. 3 men, Troopers Steele, Parry and Richards, who were overheard saying that they did not trust Beatson and would not serve under him, were court-martialled and sentenced to death. The new Australian Commonwealth government was not informed of this by the British, but men were writing letters home. The Adelaide Advertiser had already reported Beatson's insults, and by the time the court-martial was reported, by means of a private letter placed at our disposal on page 13 of the Melbourne Age on the 28th of September 1901, complete with a photo of the court-martial charge sheet, the men were already imprisoned in Britain, having had their sentences commuted, Steele to 10 years and the other 2 to 1 year's hard labour. The headline in the Age was, "A question of mutiny, Victorian sentenced to death, commuted to 10 years' imprisonment." The Age reported on the result of Beatson's comments after the unfortunate affair at Wilmensrust this way. The words he used, I have reason to believe, were, "You are white-livered curs." He afterward made an apology through the agency of Major Umfleby. The men thought he ought to have apologised personally, and this consequently led to a lot of unsoldier-like talk and discontent. The article then goes on, in a style more British than the British, to criticise those opposing the war in Britain as would-be philanthropists, and continues the jingoistic tone. "About those pom-poms, they have been retaken, or at least one has for a certainty, so they bark again on the right side. The 18th and 19th Hussars were the heroes on this auspicious occasion. Some of them have been recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, almost the acme of a soldier's ambition, as it takes precedence after the Victoria Cross. The capture was very ably accomplished near Blood River." Although the pro-British Melbourne Age did not seem inclined to call for an inquiry, there were certainly questions asked in the new federal parliament, with the result that Governor-General Lord Hopetoun was asked to seek the facts from Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, who replied in October stating, "Prisoners were sent to this country, but on receipt of proceedings of courts-martial, Judge Advocate General declared that there were legal flaws in the convictions, the men having been tried under the wrong section of the Army Act. Instructions have been issued for their immediate release and joining provisional battalions shortly." It was Lord Kitchener who had commuted the sentences to imprisonment, which removed the men to Britain, before a convenient excuse was found to free them. It is obvious that the British wished to avoid an inquiry into the Wilmansrust ambush at all costs, in order to avoid the embarrassment of exposing British officers to charges of poor leadership and inappropriate tactics. Major Morris was censured, but Kitchener decided to take no further action, telling the Secretary for War, St John Broderick, that the bitter lesson Morris had learned about setting pickets properly in South Africa was punishment enough. The Victorians continued to be blamed for the disaster and the loss of the guns. In one official British record of the war, there is even an artist's impression drawing of the ambush with the caption, "The Australians fell like rabbits." So, in spite of Australia being more British than Britain in 1901, these incidents and others mentioned in letters home and reported anecdotally, along with the courts-martial of Morant and 3 Australian officers and the execution by firing squad of Lieutenants Handcock and Morant, have fuelled the fires of republicanism in Australia for more than a century, and still serve today as a rallying point for anti-British sentiment in Australia. This ends CD 8. CD 9. The White Man's War. This is a story of murder and mayhem, plots and politics, spies and complexities, treachery and cover-ups. The characters involved rise from the pages of history as larger-than-life, colonial caricatures, fearless daredevils, wild colonial boys, cloak-and-dagger mystery men, comical mustachioed Colonel Blimps. In reality, some were also mass murderers, liars and thieves who cold-bloodedly killed bedridden civilians, prisoners unable to walk, children, and even their own regimental comrades. Everyone who researches the Morant case inevitably ends up with a theory, and I am no exception. I am of the opinion that members of the British Army Intelligence constructed their case with a specific aim of ridding the Army and the British Empire of one man, who was not even a member of the Bushveld Carbineers, although he was in effect the commanding officer of the Bushveld Carbineer troopers at Fort Edward. That man was Captain Arthur Balala Taylor, who, having resigned his commission when arrested, was tried by a British military court under martial law rather than a court-martial. I believe that the 4 Bushveld Carbineer officers found guilty were the small fry in the case being built against Taylor, and when the case against him failed to produce the desired result, they became collateral damage, and 2 were executed in an attempt to show that the British were fighting a fair and civilised war in the Transvaal, which they undoubtedly and patently were not. Why did certain members of British intelligence want to get Captain Taylor? Well, strange as it may seem, there was an unwritten gentleman's agreement between the Boers and the British that the war should be fought as a white man's war to determine which white authority had real power in South Africa. Both sides were terrified of the results of mobilising and arming African tribes and involving them in the conflict. In spite of 250 years of European occupation, in South Africa the white population was still vastly outnumbered by the original indigenous population, and there were many long-standing historical grudges to be settled. The memories of conflicts such as the Zulu and Ndebele wars were still fresh in the minds of white South Africans. The Second South African War was fought over territory that traditionally, and most modern minds would think morally, belonged to various African tribes. 80% of the population living in the area being fought over was indigenous. It was commonly believed by both sides that any war involving native tribes would be more brutal than a white man's war, that white women and children would be shown no mercy, and that such a war would increase the future possibility of whites losing control of the tribal lands they had previously taken. Both sides recognised that whoever won by using such methods would then have to deal with the consequences of the threat to white dominance that it would entail, not to mention any tribal wars that would result. When the war began, British officials instructed all magistrates in the Natal colony to appeal to Zulu chiefs to remain neutral. And in the Transvaal, President Kruger sent emissaries asking local tribes to stay out of it. Both sides denied using native troops to fight, and both sides accused the other of doing so. On the Boer side, natives were used as wagon drivers or servants to perform menial tasks and support roles in camps, and to look after the horses. In battle, native servants carried ammunition and spare rifles, and might even load rifles for their masters. But it was against the law in the Transvaal for natives to carry arms. Natives could be conscripted to build forts and perform non-combatant duties, for which they were not paid. Those refusing to work could be given 25 lashes and jailed. Although Kitchener probably covertly approved using native tribes to attack Boer farms, in the same way that he gave unwritten orders to take no prisoners, he denied doing either. When he was under enormous pressure from the British Parliament to end the conflict and cease annihilating the Boer population and burning their farms, he finally admitted, a month before the war ended, that some 10,000 natives had been issued with weapons by the British Army. This was not the same thing as raising the natives, yet there is plenty of evidence to prove that that was also happening. It was stated at times during the war by those in authority that the natives were not permitted to take any part in the fighting, but such was not the case. During the time I was in the Spelonken district with the Carbineers, the natives were twice raised, and it has been openly stated that with the connivance of others, when Colonel Grenfell went through the district, he had thousands of these savages, who were fed and paid, attached to his column, and they committed the most hideous atrocities, which no one has yet been made to account for. Lieutenant George Whitten, Scapegoats of the Empire, 1907. The natives were raised the night Harry Morant's best friend, Captain Percy Hunt, was killed attacking a Boer stronghold on the 5th of August 1901. When the news reached Fort Edward on the morning of 7th of August, Morant was emotionally distraught and unable to address the men.
Captain Taylor took charge of the situation, instructed the patrol to show no quarter, and provided Morant with a local guide and intelligence agents from his staff to accompany the patrol. The natives were again raised several nights later. George Whitton later wrote, "By nightfall we had covered more than 40 miles, and then put up at a native kraal to give the horses a feed and wait until the moon rose. Here, one of the intelligence agents left us to gather up an army of natives." When the patrol found the Boer encampment, Morant impetuously attacked before his troops had established proper positions, and the Boers mounted and escaped, except for one wounded man who could not walk and was executed by firing squad the next day on Morant's orders. After the execution, according to Whitton, the intelligence agent who had left us to raise the natives now returned with several hundred savages, but as their services were not now required, they were fed, and when they had held a war dance, were dispersed. It's obvious that Kitchener hoped his brutal tactics, burning farms, deporting or hanging captured Boer soldiers and sending women and children to concentration camps, would succeed before the outcry at home forced him to stop. Indeed, they were successful, and that success was helped immensely by two other tactics to which he gave tacit consent but always denied approving: taking no prisoners and raising the natives. Arming of blacks by the British was one of the reasons given by the Boers for their decision to discontinue the war in May 1902. When all was lost, they would rather negotiate a peace with a white enemy than a black one, that they had treated as slaves for more than 200 years. There were tribes eager to enter the war with the specific aim of reclaiming land confiscated by the Boers, and certain elements within British intelligence, very close to Kitchener, were actively aiding and abetting that possibility. None more so than Captain Arthur Taylor. The Regiment. The Bushveld Carbineers was a unit formed by Major Robert Poor in February 1901 at the request of Lord Kitchener in response to a number of mobile Boer commando units making hit-and-run raids on British troops, railways and infrastructure in the northern Transvaal. These Boers were bitter enders, who could camp out and move regularly or even melt back into the general Afrikaner population in Boer farms and towns. A tough mounted mobile force was required to find and destroy these Boer commando units, rather than sit in blockhouses waiting for them to strike. The regiment was partly funded by loyal supporters of the British living in the area who wished to see an end to the conflict. Poor was the Provost Marshal in the Transvaal, responsible for discipline in the field. He gave the task of forming the unit to Major Robert Lenihan. The recruiting base was Durban, and 660 men served during the unit's 18-month history. 43% were Australians, 31% English, and the rest were mostly South Africans, New Zealanders and Canadians. Although the unit's authorised strength was 500, its actual fighting strength was never more than about 350. In many ways, the history of the Bushveld Carbineers serves as a microcosm for the last phase of the Second South African War, and exposes to scrutiny Kitchener's policy of clearing out the Boers, and answering the guerrilla-style war being waged by Boer farmers with tactics like scorched earth, concentration camps, murder and deportation. Many of the men who joined the Bushveld Carbineers were colonial troopers released from their units after the British victory over the Boers in the second phase of the war. Others were locals who had pledged loyalty to Britain after the annexation of the Transvaal. Most were attracted by the prospect of further action and by the high rate of pay of 5 shillings a day. It was a tough unit with a tough leader, Major Robert William Lenihan.
Lenihan was given command of the Bushveld Carbineers with the rank of Major. Lieutenant Peter Handcock was commissioned and joined when the regiment was formed. Lieutenant Harry Morant, who had known Lenihan in Sydney, followed his best friend, Captain Percy Hunt, and joined in May. Lieutenant George Whitten joined in June. These 4 men, 3 Australians, Lenihan, Handcock and Whitten, and Morant, who was British but is regarded as an Australian by many, would later be the only ones of the 8 officers charged and 6 court-martialled to be found guilty of war crimes in the Spelonkin district during 1901. The regiment was part of Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Plumer's column of 1,300 men, which left Pretoria in March 1901 and advanced to capture Pietersburg, 240 kilometres to the north. The Bushveld Carbineers' first job was to ensure the British supply trains were safe from the Boers' attempts to blow up all trains on the Pietersburg-Pretoria line. This they did by placing Boer prisoners in the second carriage of a train and telling them that if they did not reveal the location of the explosive mines on the line, they would be blown up with the train. The Carbineers ran the train until the first wagon was blown up, after which the Boers revealed the positions of all the mines. Pietersburg was taken on the 14th of April and the regiment became part of the Pietersburg garrison. They established an outpost in the wild northern frontier Spelonkin district of the Transvaal, where A Squadron, under Captain James Robertson, was stationed at Fort Edward, north of Pietersburg, 2 kilometres away from Captain Taylor's headquarters at Sweetwater's Farm and Hotel. This squadron was specifically given the task of assisting Captain Taylor to rid the area of roving Boer commando units. Sweetwaters had been the site of a Boer commando camp, but when the Bushveld Carbineers moved into the district, the Boers had withdrawn from the area, so as not to cause any problems for the farm and hotel owners, Charlie and Olivia Bristow. B Squadron of the Bushveld Carbineers, under Lieutenant Harry Morant, was established at Stryport, further south on the other side of Pietersburg, in an area that was rather easier for the British to control. Dramatis Personae. To understand anything about the history of the Bushveld Carbineers and the subsequent courts-martial, it is necessary to look at the cast of characters who played some major role in the drama. As with any event in history, understanding the social and political context in which it occurred is essential to making any sense of it in retrospect. Likewise, some understanding of the backgrounds and motivations of the principal players is an essential element to any accurate understanding of what eventuated. Here are the important dramatis personae who need some introduction in this case. Edwin Henry Murrant, alias Lieutenant Harry Harbord Morant, the Breaker. The man best known as Breaker Morant claimed that he was born in Devon and was the illegitimate son of Admiral Morant, and that he was sent to Australia in disgrace as a remittance man to be kept out of the way of the family after some gambling debts were unpaid. However, both the Northern Miner and the Bulletin newspapers identified him as Edwin Henry Murrant, who had arrived at Townsville in Queensland on the SS Wahroonga on the 5th of June 1883. Murrant was in fact born in Bridgewater, Somerset, on the 9th of December 1864 and was registered as the son and second child of Edwin and Catherine Murrant, master and matron of the Union Workhouse at Bridgewater. Edwin Sr. had died of rheumatic fever 4 months earlier, in August 1864, and after his death his wife Catherine continued her employment as matron until her dismissal in 1882. This was rather unusual, as it was customary for the wife of the master of the workhouse to have the position of matron.
The Board of Guardians of the Bridgewater Union Workhouse, however, allowed Catherine to retain her position on a miserable annual salary of £40, which was less than half of what she and her husband had received previously. Apparently all was well until the appointment of James Winterson as the new master of the workhouse in 1878. It appears that he wanted his wife to have the position of matron and conducted a vendetta of accusations against Catherine. He accused her of having her children, Annie and Edwin, staying at the workhouse, and she was reprimanded and wrote a letter of apology. Catherine was also reprimanded for drunkenness, which was a sackable offence, and the situation came to a head when she was reportedly disrespectful, violent and defiant at a meeting with the Board of Guardians. As a result of this feud, both Catherine and James Winterson were dismissed in 1882. She moved to Devon and found a position as matron in the county asylum, and then became housekeeper at a grand house in Torquay, where she resided with her unmarried daughter Annie, who was 2 years older than Edwin. Catherine died in 1899, about the time that her son enlisted in the South Australian Mounted Rifles in Renmark, South Australia. Now we come to the point where the story of Edwin Murrant Harry Morant enters the realm of the unknown and unknowable. While their mother is existing on £40 per annum at the Bridgewater Workhouse, Annie and Edwin somehow both manage to get an excellent education. Annie becomes a professional musician, music tutor and organist, and can honestly describe herself in the 1881 census as Professor of Music. According to stories told by Murrant, he spent much of his childhood with an uncle, to whom he was evidently not related, Major George White Melville, a famous Scottish author, golfer and renowned horseman with properties in Gloucestershire and Fifeshire in Scotland, took Edwin under his wing. White Melville is remembered for writing popular historical novels and entertaining novels about fox hunting. He spent much of his time riding to hounds with various hunts around the south of England and served as a cavalry officer in the Crimean War. Under the guidance of White Melville, Edwin was taught to ride and prepare and train horses for hunting and developed a love of literature. Sometime around 1876, Edwin was sent as a boarder to Silesia College at Barnet on the outskirts of London, where he received an education reserved for only the privileged classes and was bright enough to become a tutor after completing his education there at the age of 15 or 16. During school holidays, his mother had to ask permission of the Board of Guardians for him to stay with her at the Bridgewater Workhouse. What on earth is going on? The truth is, no one knows. The obvious assumption is that Edwin was the illegitimate son of either White Melville or his friend Digby Morant, with whom he served in the Crimean War. Edwin Murrant, Harry Morant, always claimed that he was the illegitimate son of Admiral Sir George Digby Morant, and it is logistically possible that his mother and the young unmarried naval lieutenant had some sort of a liaison around Easter 1864. What makes that possibility seem far from credible is the fact that Catherine was an apparently respectable, poorly paid, married woman from the lower middle class with a young baby daughter working in a workhouse, while George Morant was a naval officer from a privileged Irish family. However, these things did happen. White Melville himself had fought a very public paternity suit in 1849, 2 years after he married, and the case was only dismissed when it was found that another man had been paying the child's and mother's expenses. Such things were possible in 1864, no matter how improbable they might be. Family histories are full of such secrets, but it is hard to build a credible scenario of connections in this case. If, however, the possibility is more than an unlikely probability and is the truth,
then the strange similarity of names, Murrant and Morant, must be considered a mere coincidence. Admiral Sir George Digby Morant denied to his dying day that Edwin Murrant was in any way connected to his family. When an effort was made in line with the executed lieutenant's last wishes to return his belongings to the Admiral's family, they refused to accept them. Those who believe that George Digby Morant was, or could have been, the father of Edwin Murrant, argue that he could have refused to acknowledge his son later in life because of the shame and disgrace that sent Edwin to Australia, gambling debts and/or sexual misconduct. Others suggest it was perhaps his shameful conduct in South Africa and the ignominy of his execution. Of course, it could also have been Digby's feeling of shame at his own behaviour and the desire to protect his own reputation. It could also have been because he was not his father. During his 6 or 7 years at Silesia College, there is anecdotal evidence from fellow students and pupils tutored by Murrant that he spent much of his time at local racetracks, both at Barnet and Finchley, and developed the habit of not paying his debts. There's also anecdotal evidence of some sexual misdemeanour with a girl who was a ward in Chancery, that is, an orphan who would claim her inheritance once she came of age. Those who wish to portray Murrant as a cad and a bounder claim that he was running from responsibility for his ungentlemanly crime and his gambling debts when he left for Australia aged 19. Those who prefer the more romantic version claim that he left England in order to protect the girl's reputation and never recovered from his heart being broken. Soon after he arrived in Townsville, Murrant found work with a travelling rodeo and circus and made his way to Charters Towers, where records show that Edwin Henry Murrant, son of Edwin Murrant and his wife Catherine, née O'Reilly, married Daisy May O'Dwyer on the 13th of March 1884 at the residence of James Hopgood Veal in Plant Street. Daisy May O'Dwyer would later become known as the famous anthropologist and champion of the Aboriginal people, Daisy Bates. The marriage did not last very long. Evidently, our hero established a pattern for not paying his debts quite early in his life in Australia, and the bill for the marriage celebrations was never paid. The couple separated within months after Murrant was arrested on a charge of stealing pigs and a saddle. He was acquitted and went to work further west at Winton. Later, he began overlanding cattle south through the Channel Country. Daisy moved south, was employed as a governess at Berry, New South Wales, and in February 1885 at Nowra, married cattleman Jack Bates. When he went off droving, she travelled to Sydney, where on the 10th of June 1885 she married again, to Ernest Bagelhole. There is no record of her ever divorcing any of them. Murrant, who from this point in his life called himself Harry Morant, developed a legendary and romantic reputation as a hard-drinking horsebreaker, bush poet and ladies' man. A fearless and expert horseman, he was one of the few who managed to ride the notorious buck-jumper Dargan's Grey, and once jumped his horse, Cavalier, over a 6-foot fence to win a bet. He contributed bush ballads to the Bulletin and used the pen name The Breaker. He also gained a reputation as a reckless show-off and womanising drunkard who rarely paid his bills. He was friendly with other poets like Banjo Patterson and Will Ogilvie, who liked him and helped him, but acknowledged that he was not to be trusted with money or the truth. Patterson described Morant as attention-seeking and plucky to the point of recklessness, and said he suffered from a theatrical complex which made him pretend to be badly hurt when there was really not much up with him. In a radio talk late in his life, Banjo told an anecdote about his fellow versifier who was visiting Sydney at the time of the annual Rose Hill Amateur Steeplechase, which Patterson described as a sort of Custer's last stand. Arriving in Sydney at the time of the amateur steeplechase, he set out to look for a mount. Mr. Potty, of the veterinary family, had a mare that could both gallop and jump, but she was such an unmanageable brute that none of the local amateurs, and I was one of them, cared to take the mount. Morant jumped at the chance, but as soon as they started, the mare cleared out with him and fell into a drain, rolling her rider out as flat as a flounder. He was carried in, supposed to be unconscious, and I was taken up to hear his last wishes. The doctors could get nothing out of him, but after listening to his wanderings for a while, I said, very loudly and clearly, "What'll you have, Morant?" And he said equally clearly, "Brandy and soda." Patterson also said in the Sydney Mail, Morant was always popular for his dash and courage. Money he never valued at its true worth. He was a spendthrift and an idler, quick to borrow and slow to pay. The banjo summed up the life of the breaker like this. Those who knew him best say that he would sooner have given a sick boar the coat off his back than shot him for any money. As it turned out, he got into exactly the worst company that a man of his temperament could have met. It was always so with him. What is it that such men lack? Just a touch of determination or caution, maybe, to turn their lives from failures to successes? Sydney Mail, 12th of April, 1902. Scottish poet Will Ogilvie, who spent 12 years of his life in the Australian bush, knew Morant well and liked him. He predicted, 5 years before Morant's execution, that whenever he died, there would be obligations left neglected. He will leave when his ticket is tendered a bundle of debts, I'm afraid, accounts that were many times rendered, and bills that will never be paid. When the breaker is booked for the South, the Bulletin, Volume 17, Number 883, 16th of January, 1897. When the Second African War broke out in 1899, Edwin Murrant enlisted on the 17th of October 1899 in Renmark in the 2nd Contingent South Australian Mounted Rifles as Harry Harbord Morant, and was almost immediately made Lance Corporal. By the time the contingent arrived in South Africa, he was a sergeant. His skill as a horseman and his ability to acquire horses and mules by dubious methods, as well as his charm and ability to pass as an educated gentleman, led to him becoming a dispatch rider for General French. And he also worked as an aide and guide for Bennett Burleigh, a famous British war correspondent. Also at some point he met Captain Percy Hunt. Morant had enlisted for 1 year and had served in South Africa for 9 months when the assignment ended. At the completion of his 1-year enlistment, his work was highly commended and he was offered a commission. Morant, however, was not committed to the war and decided to take the opportunity to return home to England and spend 5 months there. He claimed he sailed home with Captain Percy Hunt of the 10th Hussars, but there is documentary evidence to prove this was a lie. He certainly stayed at the Mount Nelson Hotel at Cape Town in November 1900, claiming to be a correspondent for a British newspaper and the son of Admiral Morant. We know this because, as was his custom, he never paid the bill, and there is a letter from the hotel addressed to Admiral Sir George Morant. "We shall esteem it a favour if you will let us know the course we had better adopt. We are averse to taking the matter to court till we had heard from you." During his time back home, Morant linked up with Hunt and the two men became best friends, rode to hounds and were engaged to 2 sisters. Hunt was still signed on and returned to South Africa in March 1901. Morant followed, and the two were commissioned into the Bushveld Carbineers. At first Morant was in command at Striport, to the south of Pietersburg, but after disciplined troubles at Fort Edward in July and the clean-out of the personnel, only Hancock remaining at the fort, some 60 troopers under the command of Captain Hunt and Lieutenant Morant were sent to replace the troublesome, ill-disciplined crew that had been withdrawn. After the death of his friend Percy Hunt, Morant was left in charge and, perhaps in a spirit of revenge or under the influence of Captain Taylor, committed what were later to be deemed war crimes. In spite of a successful operation, in which he captured the leader of one of the last two commando groups operating in the area along with his troops and supporters, Morant was arrested in October 1901, court-martialed and found guilty in January 1902. He was executed by firing squad on the 27th of February 1902. Captain Arthur Balala Taylor. The Bushveld Carbineers Regiment, by strict army regulations, was answerable to Area Commandant Colonel F. H. Hall at Petersburg. The squadron at Fort Edward, however, was under the influence of Arthur Taylor, a captain in the intelligence department of the British Army at Spelonkin, 115 kilometres to the north, who had led a small team of 6 agents into the area to gather information about the Boers from local tribes. Taylor had worked as a scout and mercenary for Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company in their invasion and conquest of Matabeleland and the creation of Rhodesia. He was a veteran of the Matabele-Ndebele War and the later rebellion, Second Matabele War, during which he commanded a unit of mounted scouts with Lieutenant Colonel Plumer's army. Recalled as an agent in 1900, he was, by his own account, sent to the Transvaal to get information on Boer movements, and also to scout Boer positions in the Makato Mountains and find and destroy the Boer communications station at Fort Botha, which he did. Taylor stated that these orders came second-hand from Kitchener. While engaged in this mission, Taylor had the chief of the Mamadi tribe shot dead on suspicion of collaborating with the Boers. Fort Botha turned out to be a communication station in the mountains manned by 2 men. Having smashed up the equipment, Taylor questioned the 2 Boers and discovered evidence of Boer activity in the township of Louis Tricart. He subsequently led a force of 600 men, including native irregular troops, to sack the town. The troops were allowed to loot the houses and the town was burned to the ground. 90 men were taken prisoner and the rest of the population was marched to the concentration camp at Petersburg. Taylor was then appointed Active Native Commissioner by Kitchener and told to liaise with the Bushveld Carbineers. He set up headquarters at Sweetwater's Farm, 1.5 kilometres from Fort Edward, and was acknowledged as their commanding officer by Captain James Robertson, leader of A Squadron at Fort Edward. In its version of the story of the Bushveld Carbineers, the official website for the Boer War Memorial in Canberra mentions Captain Taylor 4 times, as if he was an officer in the regiment. Taylor was never a member of the Bushveld Carbineers, but he was the man who was most responsible for the regiment's shameful reputation. Born into a middle-class Protestant family in Dublin in 1861, Taylor went to sea as a young man and arrived in Africa in 1886. Taylor has been variously described by historians as a sadistic, ruthless mass murderer, war profiteer, cattle thief, and war criminal. He was notorious for his atrocities against the Matabele-Ndebele people, who gave him the name Bulala, killer. In his role as Acting District Native Commissioner, Taylor waged a war of extermination against the Songa people, who had a close association with the local Boers. He also encouraged the local Venda and Sotho tribesmen to kill Boer farmers and help themselves to the land and whatever else they wanted, as the Boers would not be returning after the war. Tribesmen from these groups were allowed to follow British soldiers into action and loot farms and massacre local Afrikaners after the troops departed. On at least 2 occasions, the Bushveld Carbineers raised the natives, as this action was called, to help them attack farms. Under Taylor's influence, discipline in the Bushveld Carbineers was a constant problem, and the rules of engagement were vague and arbitrary at best and criminal at worst. In May 1901, when Captain Frederick de Bertadano, an experienced Australian-born intelligence officer, sought out Major Lenihan at Petersburg, he was shocked to find Taylor sitting at Lenihan's desk, filling in for the Major, who was away from his headquarters. At that time, de Bertadano was acting as District Commissioner in the Orange River Colony, which was the Boer-Orange Free State south of the Transvaal that had been annexed by Britain, although it was not yet wholly occupied by British troops. Back in Pretoria, de Bertadano informed Colonel David Henderson, Director of Military Intelligence, that Taylor's reputation stank to heaven, and warned him that trouble was bound to ensue. De Bertadano suggested that Taylor's appointment as acting District Native Commissioner be reversed, and was told it was too late. He was then given the task of keeping an eye on Bulala Taylor. De Bertadano described Taylor as an Irishman who had spent years among the natives and was known as a sadist. He frequently stirred up trouble in native kraals and then shot some native in self-defence, as he always stated. He was notorious and was distrusted by most white men he came into contact with. 2 incidents that show Taylor's modus operandi were later used in evidence against him. On the 4th of May 1901, he was part of a patrol that arrived at the Perdeplaas farm to take the wife and children of Boer commando Conrad Jacobus Vandenberg to the concentration camp at Petersburg. Unknown to the British, Vandenberg had returned home and was sick with malaria. When Taylor's men started looting the farm, the sick man, who had left the house and was hiding nearby, shot and wounded one of the troopers. Taylor, believing he was surrounded by Boer commandos, called a truce. Mrs. Vandenberg promised to care for the wounded man, and before withdrawing, Taylor promised no harm would come to her family and a patrol would be sent for the man. This was agreed, but the wounded man died and was buried by the Vandenbergs. 6 days later, Taylor returned and ordered Mrs. Vandenberg to help her sick husband from his bed to the yard, where, in front of his family, Vandenberg was shot by 15 troopers. Mrs. Vandenberg and her children were then immediately marched to the concentration camp. After the war, Mrs. Vandenberg returned to the ruined farm, where her first task was to pick up the bones of her husband, which had been scattered around the yard by wild animals. On another occasion, in pursuit of retreating Boer commandos, Taylor entered a native kraal and asked the headman which way the Boers had gone. When the man did not reply, Taylor simply took out his revolver and shot him in the head. Later in court, Taylor was found not guilty of this action, claiming that he attempted to shoot over the man's head but missed. There was a reorganisation of the Department of Native Affairs in September 1901. A new commissioner, Sir Godfrey Lagden, was appointed, and the man who would become the permanent Native Commissioner in the Northern Transvaal, Francis Enright Mooney, started to understand the manner in which Taylor had been operating. Anticipating his removal as soon as Kitchener approved it, in the lead-up to the Court of Inquiry, Colonel Hall and Colonel Henderson, head of intelligence in Pretoria, told Taylor about the changes and said that everything was fine. Enright Mooney wrote to Lagden in the first week of September, and Henderson and Hall were able to agree with his suspicions. On the 24th of September, Kitchener finally gave in to the inevitable, and Taylor was recalled to Pretoria when Enright Mooney proceeded to Sweetwaters.
and on the 21st of October had access to Taylor's files. Taylor was allowed to resign his commission, and, after a period of 3 months had elapsed, he was tried as a civilian under martial law, rather than court-martialed under the Army Act. After the trials and his acquittal, Taylor returned to his farm near Plumtree in southern Rhodesia. He was recalled to active service during World War I and served in France during 1917 and 1918 and was wounded in the leg. Arthur Taylor died from pneumonia in Bulawayo Memorial Hospital on the 24th of October 1941 and is buried in Bulawayo General Cemetery. He was described as one of Rhodesia's pioneers in his obituary in the Rhodesian Herald. In 1887 he had married Phoebe Wolfenden, a widow of mixed British and Bechuana descent. They had 8 children, who reportedly remembered him as a loving and caring father. Major Robert William Lenihan. Bob Lenihan was born in 1865 at Petersham, Sydney. Educated at St Ignatius College, Riverview, studied law, married Harriet Hodge in 1889 in the St Ignatius Chapel, and was practising as a solicitor in 1890, the same year that he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 1st Infantry Regiment. Promoted to captain in 1896 in the New South Wales Field Artillery, he was promoted again to major in December 1898 to command C Battery of the New South Wales Artillery. In 1900 he switched from artillery and dropped a rank to serve as a captain in the 1st New South Wales Mounted Infantry and embarked for South Africa in January 1900. For the next year, Lenihan was constantly engaged in the action. From February to May 1900, he served in the Orange Free State and then in the Transvaal until June. He was present at the relief of the Elands River staging post in August, and from September 1900 to February 1901 was again part of operations in the Orange Free State. His service entitled him to the Queen's South Africa Medal with 6 clasps. Bob Lenihan proved to be an efficient and energetic officer and a good leader. In February 1901 he was appointed to command the Bushveld Carbineers with the rank of Major. George Whitten said that Lenihan was commander in rank and name only, and that the Major rarely visited the outposts, which were practically under the direct control of the officers in charge. He was a good-natured man and much attached to his officers. Lenihan was arrested in October and finally told he would be court-martialed in January. He then sent 3 desperate telegrams to an old legal acquaintance, Major Thomas, who was about to depart for home, having resigned in disgust when a contingent he had raised in Australia and brought to South Africa were not allowed to fight together as an Australian unit under Australian officers. Thomas then travelled to Pietersburg and defended Lenihan and the other Carbineer officers. Lenihan appeared before the court-martial on charges of failing to report 2 incidents, the shooting of 2 men and a boy, and the shooting of Trooper Van Buren. He was found guilty of, when on active service by culpable neglect, failing to make a report which it was his duty to make, in the case of the shooting of Van Buren. He was found not guilty of the other charge and was reprimanded, which was the lightest possible sentence, imprisoned at Cape Town and deported on the SS Aberdeen. It was only after the ship docked in Melbourne on the 25th of March 1902 that Prime Minister Edmund Barton and the Parliament learned that an Australian officer, Peter Hancock, had been executed and another, George Whitten, had a death sentence commuted to penal servitude for life. At first, Lenihan was not transferred from the New South Wales Colonial Military List to the Australian Military Forces, but was placed on the retired list. He continued to seek justice, insisting that he verbally reported both incidents to Colonel Hall, who was not called as a witness as he was in India.
After Labor won government in 1904, Prime Minister Chris Watson took up the case, requested that the British War Office provide a copy of the court-martial proceedings, and asked if there was any further evidence against Lenihan. When the War Office replied that there was not, Lenihan was placed on the active military list, backdated in seniority to the 1st of July 1903, and commanded No. 1 Battery, Australian Field Artillery, until appointed to command the 4th Field Artillery Brigade with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. During World War I, he was on full-time duty commanding the military camp at Menangle until late in 1917, when he was named as co-respondent in a very public divorce case. He was relieved of his position at Menangle Camp and later placed on the retired list in August 1918 and died in Sydney in 1922 of cirrhosis of the liver. Lieutenant Peter Handcock. Veterinary Lieutenant Peter Handcock was born in the village of Peel, 15 kilometres north of Bathurst, New South Wales in 1868. He was the third of 8 surviving children of an Irish mother and an English father, a farmer, who died when Peter was 6 years old. He was apprenticed to a blacksmith when he was 12 years old and described himself as a labourer from Dubbo when, aged 20, he married Bridget Martin at the Catholic Cathedral in Bathurst. He later worked as a blacksmith on the railways. After saying farewell to his wife and 3 children, Handcock enlisted for the Second South African War as a shoesmith, farrier, in the 2nd contingent of the 1st New South Wales Mounted Rifles. He arrived in Cape Town in February 1900 and was promoted to farrier sergeant, and also served for some time in the Railway Services Police Force. 1 year after arriving in South Africa, he obtained a lieutenant's commission as Veterinary Transport Officer in the Bushveld Carbineers. At the court-martial, Handcock was accused of killing Boer prisoners, a fellow Bushveld Carbineers trooper, and a Lutheran missionary. He was found guilty of the first 2 charges and was sentenced to death. In his defence, it is patently true that he was carrying out orders given by Morant and Taylor. The often forgotten Australian in the story is Intelligence Officer Captain Frederick de Bertadano, who encouraged British intelligence to build the case against Taylor. He referred to Handcock as a poor fool, a man who blindly followed orders and did the dirty work for Taylor in order to cover up any evidence of theft and profiteering. In his own defence at the trial, Handcock claimed, "I've had a very poor education. I never cared much about being an officer. All I know about is horses. Though I like to fight, I did what I was told to do, and I cannot say any more." In what almost amounts to a confession, Handcock wrote to his sister, "If I overstep my duty, I can only ask my people and country for forgiveness." In 1910, Lord Kitchener visited Australia. He was asked to travel to Bathurst to unveil a magnificent memorial to those who lost their lives in the Boer War. Peter Handcock's name was not on the monument, which gave rise to a story that Kitchener had it removed. There is one third-hand anecdotal account of this possibly happening, based on a report that the ceremony was alleged to have been delayed and Kitchener left without attending the reception after the ceremony. But otherwise there is no evidence to support this story. Handcock's name was added in 1964, and a further 39 names have been added since. Verification of the names to go on the monument was the responsibility of the local council, and at least one of the names was that of a man who had never left Australia. There is no sign of any damage from the removal of a name. In Handcock's defence, it can be said that although he cold-bloodedly killed one man, probably 2, neither of whom were enemy combatants, he was undoubtedly following orders and not making personal decisions to kill. Handcock was executed by firing squad on the 27th of February 1902. Lieutenant George Ramsdale Whitten.
George Whitten was born into a farming family on a dairy farm near Warrnambool in 1874 and was 24 when he joined the 4th contingent of the Victorian Imperial Bushmen as a corporal and sailed for South Africa on the 1st of May 1900. He had served in a volunteer artillery unit that had a role in manning the guns at Fort Queenscliff, protecting Port Phillip Bay, and was part of the permanent artillery unit there when the war started. He had risen to the rank of Sergeant Major while serving in South Africa with the Victorian Imperial Bushmen, and when the unit was being disbanded and sent home in May 1901, Whitten was offered a commission as a lieutenant in the Bushveld Carbineers by Major Lenihan, who was having trouble finding enough men to keep the Bushveld Carbineers ranks operational, on the condition that he recruited the 30 men necessary for an artillery unit. The Bushveld Carbineers never operated at full strength, and after the reorganisation at Fort Edward following the shooting of 6 Boers attempting to surrender and a Carbineer trooper suspected of Boer sympathies in July 1901, a group of near-mutinous troopers were allowed to leave the regiment without penalty. Just after this, Whitten arrived at regimental headquarters in Pietersburg to be told by Lenihan that the guns he was hoping to take charge of had not arrived. He reluctantly acted briefly as quartermaster before being ordered to replace his friend Lieutenant Bourdonnais, who had injured a leg playing polo, as the officer in charge of a group of 19 reinforcements being sent to assist the newly reorganised Squadron A unit at Fort Edward. Bourdonnais was possibly the reason Whitten joined the Carbineers. He had acted as best man at Bourdonnais' wedding in Cape Town. By the time Whitten arrived at Fort Edward, the officer in charge, Captain Percy Hunt, had been killed, and Morant had taken over the command. None of the troubles at Fort Edward were of Whitten's making. He denied shooting any prisoners except in self-defence when one man grabbed his rifle and attempted to kill him with it. He claimed he tried to convince Morant not to execute a wounded prisoner and walked away while the execution went ahead. Nevertheless, he was the 3rd officer sentenced to death at the courts-martial. Having had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment by Kitchener, he spent 3 years in British prisons, where he suffered typhoid and arsenic poisoning from working at the prison furnaces, before being released after constant agitation from the Australian Parliament and others. He was never pardoned. Whitten returned to Australia and was a dairy farmer in Victoria until his marriage to Mary Humphrey in 1913. He then took up farming at Biggenden, about 100 kilometres west of Maryborough in Queensland, where he became a Justice of the Peace and director of the Biggenden Cheese Factory. In 1907 he wrote a book giving his version of the events in the Spelonken district in 1901 and the trials and his time in prison. The book was called Scapegoats of the Empire, and it was a standard source of information for historians researching the affair for many years. When Andrew Fisher famously pledged at the start of World War I that Australia would defend Britain to our last man and last shilling, Whitten commented sarcastically that he would be that last man. After Mary died in 1931, he remarried and moved back to Victoria, living first in Gippsland and later in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne at Canterbury. When he died on the 14th of August 1942, after having a heart attack while cranking his car, he was described as a retired real estate agent. Whitten was survived by his second wife, Carolyn, and there were no children by either marriage. Brisbane City Council records show his ashes were interred in the grave of his first wife, Mary, at Lutwyche Cemetery in Brisbane on the 1st of October 1942. Lutwyche Cemetery is, ironically, situated on Kitchener Road. Frederick Raymond de Bertadano Lopez, 8th Marquis del Moral. Frederick de Bertadano Lopez was born in 1871 at Lismore, New South Wales. He was a grandson of a Spanish nobleman, Raymond Roman de Bertadano, y Lopez, who in 1837 married Henrietta, daughter of James Patterson, the Governor of the Bank of England. The gold chain on the family crest commemorated their ancestors who fought the Moors in 1212. Frederick's father, Raymond Edward de Bertadano Lopez, was born in Stoke, Surrey, in 1848. He married Mary Jane Brand Wilson in Grafton in 1870 and became a well-known colonial racehorse breeder in northern New South Wales. Frederick was the eldest of their 4 children and later inherited the rather useless family title. Educated at Armidale Grammar School and Sydney University, Frederick passed his law exams, left for England and trained as a lawyer. He travelled to Rhodesia and took part in the fighting against the Matabele, Ndebele, in 1896 and was a solicitor in Bulawayo. Back in England, he joined the Manchester Regiment as second lieutenant in 1899, was promoted to captain in January 1900 and seconded to South Africa. He served as District Commissioner in the newly annexed Orange Free State, and when there was an inquiry into his activities dealing with cattle as District Commissioner, he indignantly defended himself by threatening to spill the beans about the far worse activities and war crimes being committed in the Spelonken district. As a result of this, he was exonerated and seconded to the intelligence unit in Pretoria. De Bertadano established a network of intelligence gathering and was probably using the Lutheran missionary Daniel Heese and some of his trusted native workers to gather information about the illegal activities of Taylor and the Bushveld Carbineers. Heese was driving a mule buggy that de Bertadano had lent him when he and his servant were shot dead, allegedly by Hancock, on orders from Taylor and Morant. Whether de Bertadano was aware that a case against Taylor was being built at a higher level without Kitchener's knowledge is uncertain. The political inner workings of the intelligence headquarters at Pretoria were dark and mysterious, and there were plans afoot to get rid of Taylor before Heese's murder. It was the event, however, that most historians think finally got Kitchener to agree to the courts-martial. De Bertadano was not called to give evidence at the courts-martial. After the war, he returned to London and in 1908 married Lady Isa Elizabeth Dalziel, the daughter of Robert Dalziel, 11th Earl of Carnwath. Between the Boer War and World War I, Frederick de Bertadano was London director of the Fiat Motor Company, and the couple lived at Fulham, employed 6 servants, and eventually had 6 children. On the outbreak of war in 1914, Frederick was commissioned as a major in the Nottinghamshire Yeomanry and later served as a General Staff Officer from December 1915 until the armistice and was mentioned in dispatches. His wife Ida died in 1924, and having inherited the family title on his father's death in 1932, he married again in 1934 to Geetha Mary Dorothy Staunton, daughter of Herbert Staunton, OBE. They had 1 child, a son, Alfonso Michael George de Bertadano, who outlived his stepbrothers to become the 9th Marquis del Moral in 1955. 2 family trees record Frederick's death as occurring in Zimbabwe in 1955, but he is buried at St John's Churchyard in Hampstead. Lord Kitchener. Horatio Herbert Kitchener was born in County Kerry, Ireland, the son of a British Army officer who had purchased land there when he gave up his commission. When Kitchener was a child, the family moved to Switzerland, and he was educated in Montreux and later at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in London. He spoke perfect French and was an excellent linguist, fluent in Arabic and Turkish, as well as quite a few Bedouin dialects. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was the archetypal mustachioed British Army officer. When Kitchener was 19, he joined the French Army and served in the Franco-Prussian War as an ambulance officer. in defiance of the British neutrality during that conflict. At age 24, he joined a British military expedition that spent 4 years surveying and mapping the Holy Lands and Jordan. He was British vice-consul in Turkey until he was promoted to captain. Then he was sent to Egypt, a British protectorate, under nominal Turkish rule, to help rebuild the Egyptian army. Kitchener became a national hero when he led an army into the Sudan, and at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 he avenged the death of General Charles Gordon at Khartoum 13 years earlier. Gordon had been killed and beheaded when the Sudanese capital of Khartoum fell to the army of the Sudanese Sufi sheikh Muhammad Ahmed, who claimed to be the messianic Mahdi of Islamic legend. The year-long siege ended in 1885 with the massacre of 10,000 British troops and civilians. Muhammad Ahmed died shortly after his victory at Khartoum, but the Mahdist state he had established continued under his successor, Abdullah ibn Muhammad, until the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Kitchener, whose army was hugely outnumbered, laid siege to the Mahdist capital of Omdurman with the River Nile to his rear, and gunboats and artillery pounded the city. When the Mahdist army, known as Ansars, but labelled dervishes by the British, poured out to attack, they were crushed by the smaller British force. Kitchener lost 500 men, while the Ansar losses were 11,000 dead and 17,000 wounded. Kitchener's troops then massacred the wounded, and Kitchener ordered the tomb of the Mahdi to be blown up and his bones thrown into the Nile. Winston Churchill, who fought in the battle as a cavalry officer, later wrote that the victory was disgraced by the inhuman slaughter of the wounded. Later that year, Kitchener was made Baron Kitchener of Khartoum by Queen Victoria, negotiated the French withdrawal from the Sudan without bloodshed, and became the Governor-General of the Sudan. Kitchener was described by British war correspondent George Washington Stevens in his book With Kitchener to Khartoum as more like a machine than a man. He was, however, a very effective Governor-General. He set about making the country an efficient and well-governed part of the British Empire. He established the Gordon Memorial College, which was open to children of all backgrounds and religions, and later became Khartoum University. He established freedom of religion and recognised Islamic holidays. He even attempted to stop Christian missionary groups trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. When the Second South African War was not going well at the end of 1899, Field Marshal Lord Roberts took over from General Redvers Buller, and Kitchener was made Chief of Staff to Roberts. When Roberts returned home in December 1900, after the annexation of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, Kitchener took over and continued Roberts' policies of burning farms, putting women and children into concentration camps, and sending captured Boers to prisons in St Helena and other parts of the British Empire. Kitchener was under extreme pressure to end the war, but was prevented from any compromise solution by the arch-conservative governor of the Cape Colony, Sir Alfred Milner, who wanted to destroy the Boer language and culture and make the new territories totally British. At the same time, Kitchener was being criticised at home for using inhumane tactics in the Transvaal. Having aided and encouraged Captain Arthur Taylor's tactics in the Transvaal in an effort to hasten the end of the war, Kitchener finally gave in to the pressure from within his own intelligence unit at Pretoria and agreed to let Taylor be arrested. Taylor was allowed to resign his commission, which meant that he could only be tried under military law for a period of 3 months. Oddly, those arrested were kept in solitary confinement, and the trial was delayed for exactly 3 months. When only 2 ex-carbineers, Captain James Robertson and Lieutenant Picton, agreed to testify against Taylor and he was found not guilty, Kitchener, under pressure to show some evidence that the British were fighting honourably, signed the death warrants for Morant and Hancock. Negotiations for a peace treaty had begun in December 1901. Kitchener argued for a generous compromise peace treaty that would recognise certain rights for the Afrikaners and promise future self-government. The Treaty of Vereeniging, which included many of his proposals, was signed in May 1902. Kitchener, as Field Marshal, was commander of the British forces in India until 1911, when he returned to Egypt as Consul General. In 1914, he was created Earl of Khartoum and Broome, and was the Secretary of State for War when World War I began. On the 5th of June 1916, he was aboard the cruiser HMS Hampshire on his way to negotiate with the Tsar of Russia when the vessel hit a German mine just off the Orkney coast in a force 9 gale and sank. There were only 12 survivors. Kitchener and his entourage were among the 737 who drowned. A ruthless and efficient soldier and administrator, Kitchener was described by a fellow officer as morbidly afraid of showing any feeling or enthusiasm, and someone who preferred to be misunderstood rather than be suspected of human feeling. Kitchener said of himself, at age 34, "I have become such a solitary bird that I often think I were happier alone." In Mark Urban, Generals, 10 British Commanders Who Shaped the World, 2005. He never had a close relationship with a woman and was possibly either latently or actively homosexual. His friend and aide-de-camp, Captain Oswald Fitzgerald, described as his constant and inseparable companion, was also drowned when HMS Hampshire went down. Major John Francis Thomas. Born on the 25th of July 1861 into a respectable middle-class family in the Sydney suburb of St Mary's, Thomas attended the King's School in Sydney and Sydney University before becoming an articled clerk in a Sydney law firm and qualifying to practice as a solicitor in 1887. After an unsuccessful attempt to build a practice in the tough northern New South Wales tin mining town of Emmaville, he moved in 1890 to the nearby town of Tenterfield in New South Wales, but close to the Queensland border, where he established a very successful law practice and in 1898 became the owner and editor of the Tenterfield Star newspaper. Thomas was a staunch supporter of federation and also active in the colonial militia, becoming a captain in the Tenterfield Rifles. When the Second South African War began, he helped to raise a unit of men from nearby towns in the colonies of Queensland and New South Wales that became part of the 1st New South Wales Mounted Rifles. They sailed for South Africa just 3 weeks after war was declared. Thomas himself departed Sydney as a captain with A Squadron of the New South Wales Citizens Bushmen on the 28th of February 1900. 6 months later, he was among the 105 New South Welshmen present at the legendary defence of the outpost at Elands River. Bob Lenihan was a member of the relieving force at Elands River. The two men had known each other through legal circles in Sydney. Lenihan had been a practising lawyer when Thomas was doing his articles. In January 1901, Thomas was in charge of a convoy of supply wagons with an escort of 21 New South Wales bushmen and 53 members of the West Riding Infantry, who had just been discharged from hospital. They were attacked by 300 Boers, and after the West Riding troops ran out of ammunition, they surrendered and the supplies were lost. Thomas and the New South Wales men were blamed for the loss, although Kitchener later exonerated the Australians of any blame and Thomas was promoted to Major. He was then allowed to return home to raise another contingent, which he did. This time, however, he was determined to make one important condition when raising another unit of Australians. He stipulated to the military in South Africa that the men who volunteered to fight should fight as Australians under Australian officers. On arrival in South Africa, however,
The officers were told they were not needed, and the men were assigned to imperial units. Many of the Australian recruits were commandeered to fight with Major John Stuart Murray as part of a Scottish regiment, and others were enlisted into the Canadian Scouts, whose reputation for brutality would become as bad as that of the Bushveld Carbineers. Thomas was offered a commission in this unit, but refused to accept unless the unit was renamed the Canadian and Australian Scouts. When this was refused, he was offered a free passage home. Totally disillusioned, he accepted the offer and was about to depart when he received Bob Lenihan's desperate telegrams asking for help. Thomas had only a day to acquaint himself with the case, and with no experience as a criminal lawyer, conducted a spirited defence of the charges. After the decisions were handed down, he continued to argue for clemency and even a pardon based on the heroic defence of the Petersburg garrison by Morant and Hancock during the trial. He was the one to claim the bodies of Morant and Hancock and see to their burial. He arranged the burial service, which omitted much of the traditional liturgy and mentioned that they were buried in unconsecrated ground. There is a photo of him at the gravesite. He was active in petitioning for Witten's release and assisted Witten in the preparation of his book, Scapegoats of the Empire. He resigned his commission and never used the title Major after returning home. He considered writing his own account of the trial, but instead assisted Witten to write his account. Thomas sold the Tenterfield Star in 1915 and his legal practice in 1919. In 1925, having returned to practising law, he was sued by a client, declared bankrupt and jailed in Long Bay Prison for refusing on principle to pay damages. Bankruptcy and refusal to release monies from a deceased estate led to him being debarred from practising law, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision in 1928. He spent the last 17 years of his life running a small accountancy practice in Tenterfield and died, aged 81, on his small farm holding at Bunabunu, 17 kilometres from the town. This ends CD 9.